I'm delighted to welcome us to the second day of this symposium and to our first speaker for today, Ian Jarvie. He is a founder and editor of the Philosophy of the Social Sciences. He's been a colleague, collaborator, and friend of Yehezkeli since the 1960s. He has an emeritus position at York University, Toronto, and like Agassi, Jarvie got his PhD under Popper's supervision. Ian.
Thank you, Jeremy. Congratulations to you and to Nimrod for organizing this event, which, judging by yesterday, is outstandingly good. And of course, add to that Agassi, who's the motivating creature behind it. Now, in order to fit my 20 minutes, I have hacked my paper into pieces. The problem I explore in this paper is the intellectual relationship between Popper and Agassi. Consider first their social relationship. It went through 2 and possibly 3 phases: student and teacher, defender and defendant, and critical fan, estranged teacher. The phases overlapped, it goes without saying. A fan is someone enthusiastic about a person or a cause. A critical fan is someone whose enthusiasm does not cloud their judgment or their autonomy, so that from time to time they offer criticism and or dissent from the person or cause. Social. Now to consider the ideas of Popper and Agassi. There is little doubt that they are aligned on many issues in philosophy, above all in endorsing a critical attitude. There are also, however, intellectual disagreements, and it is on 3 of these which I concentrate. I see this claim that they have disagreements as a mix of historical and philosophical. Hence, some of my arguments will be loose in the way that historical arguments always are. Others, the philosophical, will, I hope, be a little more rigorous. Now I begin the hacking. The paper is in 4 parts: background chit-chat, ethics, metaphysics, and methodological individualism. I'm going to leave out background, and I'm going to leave out ethics, and I'm going to move immediately from the beginning to the part of my paper that has a heading. For those of you who downloaded it, to look at it, it has the heading, if I can find it. Where did it go? Heading. Sorry about this, it's not a performance. Ethics. Thing is, the ethics section is very long, rather rambling. Here's metaphysics. To be quick about it, both philosophers appreciated rather than deplored metaphysics in their considered statements. Their differences are thus not sharp. Historically, it is hard to discover how friendly Popper was to metaphysics when he was young and an aspiring philosopher. Agassi, by contrast, has always affirmed that metaphysics was the first and foremost of his interests, inspired, as he often said, by Einstein. The intellectual scene where Popper matured was Vienna between the wars, the Vienna, that is, of the Vienna Circle, one of the most vigorous positivist movements ever. Its manifesto of 1929 saw magic and metaphysics and religion as enemies of the working class and in need of exterminating with the help of science aggressively wielded. Following Hume closely, the authors of the pamphlet claimed that the problems with metaphysics was that it sounded profound, yet on closer inspection turned out to be empty. Hume had said of such philosophy that it was mere sophistry and illusion. What thought crimes, if I may use such a technical term, what thought crimes did the circle have in mind? Popper said in his 1974 Schild paper that their main target was religion. Of course, they were in Austria, which would eventually have a clerico-fascist regime. Other evidence would suggest that their target was actually Heidegger. Carnap went to the trouble of dissecting some Heidegger text to show that there was nothing to it, a technique that Popper applied many years later both to Hegel in the Open Society and to Adorno. Anyway, the claim made by me here is that young Popper had very little truck with metaphysics. He was not a defender or advocate of it, and he tried quite strenuously to exclude it and debates about it from his work on the methodology of science. This seems to be more because he wanted a minimalist philosophy with as few complications as possible, inherited from the tangled past, rather than from any clear objection to any particular metaphysical doctrine. So we find that in the logic of scientific discovery, Popper carefully eschews discussing truth and suggests instead to discuss falsity, especially falsity revealed by contradiction. Hence, the discovery of a contradiction in science implies falsity somewhere in the system, and hence the need to try to figure out its location and extent. One could also argue that his entire strategy of turning metaphysical questions into methodological ones is deployed because he thought that they might more fruitfully be argued that way. When discussing the scope of science, he says anything that can be described should be subject to explanation. This is quite a positivistic point of view. It excluded from science the vague, the ineffable, and of course, the intangible. In his later work, after the war, Popper tries to indicate that he did not partake wholeheartedly in the anti-metaphysical program of the Vienna Circle. He says he was never a positivist. Like any such memory, this one needs to be checked against evidence. In his own case, this evidence is his writings, including the early ones. He was, we know, a close student of Kant. Kant is, among other things, an idealist metaphysician. Although Popper had studied Kant, we might not want to say that Popper was a Kantian. What particularly interested him in Kant were Kant's thoughts on the problem of how it is possible to have knowledge of the world. Kant was secure in asking this question because he considered that Newton had bequeathed such knowledge to humankind. The question then was, how was this possible? Popper came of age after Einstein had started to argue that Newton's ideas were not secure, that in certain physical situations they gave erroneous predictions, and that better ones could be found using some new ideas, including those that Einstein proposed. Popper took an interest in the history of science, certainly, but seldom used historical arguments to make his methodological points. Most of his historical energy, as you all know, went into classical studies, the pre-Socratics and Plato, and perhaps there we see clearly his warm appreciation of speculative metaphysical ideas. He puts them front and center in the Open Society and its enemies when he traces to Heraclitus the idea that change or flux is universal, and he posits that Plato accepted this and used as a premise. Change may be pervasive and unstoppable, but it is undesirable since things change, things that change always get worse. So at the very least, we should try to arrest change. The change in question, of course, was social change. Plato looked back to a golden age in the past when social life was perfect. The further we get in time from that golden age, the worse things are. So all our efforts in social engineering should go into freezing change. To my argument that Popper was discussing metaphysics all along in the Open Society, it could be objected that in substantial work published earlier, especially his series of articles on the poverty of historicism, Popper was less friendly towards metaphysics. In that work, Popper explicitly said that if there were not empirical checks on the social sciences, they could degenerate into futile metaphysical speculation. To avoid that, he proposed to focus on the methodological counterparts of such discussions, which could be rationally discussed. In section 20 of that work, entitled The Technological Approach to Sociology, he wrote, "It is one of my main points that the technological approach is likely to prove fruitful in giving rise to significant problems of a purely theoretical kind. But besides helping us in the fundamental task of selecting problems, the technological approach imposes a discipline on our speculative inclinations, which, especially in the field of sociology proper, are liable to lead us into the region of metaphysics. For it forces us to submit our theories to definite standards, such as standards of clarity and practical testability." What Popper is intimating here is that our speculative inclinations can lead us into barren and futile disputes. Metaphysics, as he warned in a later footnote, is unscientific. Is this a trace of the positivism of his time? It's unclear. He did not think unscientific assertions were meaningless, but he certainly thought a lot of idealist philosophy was irrationalist. I repeat, he steadfastly maintained that he was never a positivist. He had, however, at the end of his paper in mind, What is Dialectic, 1940, written the following: "The whole development of dialectic should be a warning against speculative philosophy. It should remind us that philosophy must not be made the basis for any sort of scientific system, and that philosophers should be much more modest in their claims. For their task, which they can fulfill quite usefully, is the study of the methods of science." Unquote. When the paper was reprinted in Conjectures and Refutations, Popper very slightly toned down this passage. Quote, "The whole development of dialectic should be a warning against the dangers inherent in philosophical system building. It should remind us that philosophy must not be made the basis for any sort of scientific system, and that philosophers should be much more modest in their claims. One task which they can fulfill quite usefully is the study of the critical methods of science." Unquote. So speculative philosophy is weakened to philosophical system building, and their task has become one task, while the methods of science has become the critical methods of science. The tone of the earlier phrasing is much more that of the Vienna Circle Manifesto. The tone of the latter is much more the Popper of 1963, who had generalized his philosophy into a version of Socratic critical fallibilism. Yet it still seems to insist that some fishy philosophical system should not be the basis for any kind of scientific system. In connection with ethics, by the way, it should be noted that in both versions Popper enjoins philosophers to be much more modest in their claims. Much more modest than what? Or who? Than those of metaphysicians who see philosophy as the master science? My question's rhetorical. By the time of his Back to the Pre-Socratics of 1958, Popper was ready to allow that these purely speculative ancient Greek thinkers had laid the basis for both atomism and for the idea of a block universe, ideas which underlay conflicts in contemporary physics. Agassi had started to study with Popper in 1953, and in 1956, he submitted his PhD dissertation, quote, "The Function of Interpretation." Hello? What happened here? The function of interpretation in physics, unquote. That word interpretation in Agassi's dissertation title always puzzled me. And I do not remember finding any sharp discussion of it in the bulky text. I cannot square to having read the whole thing. For all intents and purposes, I translated interpretation to mean metaphysics. The gist of the dissertation, as you know, appeared in 2014, rewritten and with up-to-date scholarship. Of its 4 epigraphs, 3 by Einstein, Maxwell, and Faraday aggressively promote speculation and imagination. Only the first epigraph from Bacon is against. The most straightforward way out of this history is to assume that Agassi discussed with Popper his findings as he read the literature on early science, working his way from Bacon and Boyle to Faraday. That reading was itself an anti-positivist gesture in that all kinds of intellectual output was mixed into the works of those men. They were not inventing and demarcating science. They were trying to set up methods and the institutions to house those methods. Popper, who had never done historical research of this kind, undoubtedly drank it all in. There is no trace in Agassi's Apprentice of Popper saying to Agassi, "Stop filling your mind with all this barren speculation and metaphysics and concentrate on the scientific and the testable." Had there been any such injunction, there can be little doubt Agassi would have told us about it. That, at any rate, is the most straightforward hypothesis. No longer living in a philosophical atmosphere actively hostile to certain strands of metaphysics, idealism, religion, Popper heard from the sources in the British Museum and elsewhere that all sorts of curious ideas were abroad among the early scientists Agassi was reading. And of course, in the most detailed study he conducted, that of Faraday, Agassi found the man's whole project driven by a somewhat speculative idea to the effect that matter was fields of force and fields of force were polarizations of empty space. These ideas were bold, and they informed Faraday's research and his writings. Alas, according to Agassi, his biographers, like his contemporaries, persisted in viewing him as an experimenter and a discoverer, where he himself wanted to be known as a theoretician. Agassi has even described how Popper, to an extent, identified with the misunderstood Faraday, since he was also convinced he was misunderstood. He craved a different reputation from the one he could see developing in his own lifetime. In an extraordinary gesture when writing his autobiography, he set out to formulate and dismantle what he called the Popper legend. So the story is hard to bring together. The Open Society and Its Enemies of 1945 delves deeply into ancient Greek metaphysics to explain why Plato in particular was a reactionary. Popper accepts as a graduate student someone who wants to explore the origins of modern science, and in particular, the way speculative and untestable ideas can drive scientific research. By both their accounts, they interacted intensely. After their encounter, Popper discusses metaphysics and its interaction with science in a much less cautious and prudish way. He does not tell us again that our speculative inclinations have seeds of danger. On the contrary, he starts stressing his appreciation of bold conjectures and vigorous refutations. He generalizes his highly focused refutationism into a philosophy that appreciates all critical discussion, even that which does not lead to decisive empirical tests. End of the metaphysics section. For some reason now, instead of seeing Jeremy, I see Stefano. Is there a way this can be put back?
Sorry about that.
No, I think Ian.
There you are.
Ian, I think you're lucky. What I should say is you've had 20 minutes, so you can take a few more minutes, but you need to bear in mind that you are now at the 20-minute point.
Well, that's a bit of a dilemma, because I have another 5 or 6 minutes to go. Let me try instead to improvise and summarize what I have to say. On rereading Agassi's work on methodological individualism, especially the crucial papers of that title and of the other title, Institutional Individualism, and thinking back over the many discussions I had with Agassi about this in Hong Kong and elsewhere, I came to the conclusion that Agassi himself rather veiled his criticism of Popper's views of methodological individualism. It's consistent with his own practice, which is always to try to get people's views correct before starting to attack them. We both were friends of Ernest Gellner, who in 1956 had launched a very strong attack on methodological individualism. Unfortunately, his target was a paper by John Watkins, which was really a kind of abortion that Watkins had himself to withdraw because he had collapsed methodological individualism into exactly what it shouldn't be, namely psychological individualism. And as our appreciation of Gellner increased over time, especially when we started to work on editing his papers, I certainly, and I think Agassi too, began to see that Gellner's arguments were rather devastating. That Gellner's point that you could not study a segmentary kinship system with a methodological individualist outlook, that you had rather to see it as an institutional setup that was not, so to speak, under control of the actors, but was in effect controlling the actors, that this argument could not be easily turned, and that it was coming out of a very powerful social science, namely the science of social anthropology. And so what I try to show in my section is that Agassi was a critic of methodological individualism, and that his suggestion for a change of terminology from methodological individualism to institutional individualism is not a mere change of terminology. It's actually a certain kind of repudiation of methodological individualism as it was formulated by Popper. And I conclude that this has to do with Agassi having studied the social sciences, including anthropology, a good deal more carefully and thoughtfully than Popper himself, although that's a bit of a presumption on my part. And that's the end of the paper. I have said that their ethical disagreements are a bit of a storm in a teacup, because on the main points, they really do agree. On their metaphysical disagreement, I think there was influence, even though Popper tried to play it down and indeed even rewrite the past to pretend that he was not influenced by the anti-metaphysical atmosphere of his younger days. And in the case of methodological individualism, I think there's a genuine clash. And if anything, Agassi comes down on the side of Durkheim rather than on the side of the Austrians. And I leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Ian. Could I ask people if they would like to pose a question or to...
I would like to.
Sorry, to raise a criticism, if you can use the electronic hand, just so that I don't miss anyone. We have John Wettersten first. Then.
Okay, thank you. I want to make a small point, Ian, about your portrayal of Popper in Vienna. You portrayed his relationship to the positivist school, but you didn't mention the Würzburgers. And he, as a doctorate student by Buber, defended a three-world theory. This is the same three-world theory which he later published in a book. So one can't simply push it aside as a youthful fantasy. It stuck with him. He reinvented it or reformulated it much later and defended it. That's all.
Yehezkeli.
First of all, I want to thank Ian and to corroborate what he says about me personally and to strengthen it with a story. It was Max Born who came to London to attack Schrödinger's opinion about the electron. And he said it's not so much what opinion he had, but that he had an opinion. That is to say, he gave a positivist attack on Schrödinger. And I wrote a page saying what I've just told you and showed it to Popper. And he said, that is your doctorate. And so it was. And the main point about it is that tradition wanted to square metaphysics with physics. And I thought Popper opened the door to the opposite, to contrast metaphysics and physics. And that is my idea of the function of interpretations, that the clash between metaphysics and physics is a kind of challenge that pushes research forward. Thank you very much.
Any other hands? If not, could I put a brief point in, which is that Popper is certainly wanting to expand, I mean, in Die beiden Grundprobleme and in the logic of scientific discovery, Popper is certainly wanting to remove metaphysics from his own approach. But he does in the text of the logic of scientific discovery itself, admit that atomism as a metaphysical approach had a positive effect on the development of science alongside other kinds of metaphysics which were problematic. And it's also the case that he certainly claimed that by the late 1940s, he was talking about metaphysical research programs in his lectures. So I don't know how significant this is. I just wonder if you have any reaction, Ian.
I think to John and to you, Jeremy, I say that it's very difficult to sort out what's going on. Popper clearly, when writing his works for publication, wants to join the club of people he admired, but with whom he disagreed about certain things. And I think he tried to play up aspects of his philosophy that he thought they would find appealing, including a certain underlying hostility to certain kinds of metaphysics. But everybody is, of course, right that he's dabbling in it from the very beginning. If the arguments are correct, there's no avoiding that. I mean, even the positivists are dependent on metaphysics to an extent that they wouldn't want to admit. So, you know, the history is tangled. It's made worse by the fact that Popper tries to write the history himself and emphasizes or even overlooks things that are inconvenient to the particular line he's taking a particular point, but which of course have now all been dug up and widely discussed. So it's a very tricky history to get right. But insofar as we can say that Agassi is a kind of Einsteinian, it's a much more full-throated approach and isn't constrained by club joining or anything like that Popper was up to. If I can give an analogous argument, you yourself, Jeremy, and others have looked very closely at the passages in Popper where he's trying very hard to what do they call it? To cultivate or to groom Hayek, and to suggest to Hayek that they're really very much in close agreement, and that Popper's not really one of these dangerous socialists and so on. And most of us find on close examination that these passages are both unconvincing and inconsistent. So, you know, it's a little naughty to attribute too much to Popper, but I think he was very confused in his loyalties, and I think he was, of course, as a philosopher who was friendly to metaphysics. He was not a Hume. He was not a commit everything like that to the flames. And what happened is that he was persuaded, perhaps even against certain loyalties that he had to come out and say so. And of course he did. He did it extensively, as Jeremy says already in his lectures, as John says already in his own PhD work. But it was a slow and it was an almost agonizing process. I mean, go back and look at those hostile passages in The Poverty of Historicism. They're very strange. They really do ring of 1929 and not of 1943, 1944, which is when they're published, and when he's already written, for example, the first volume of The Open Society, which huge amounts of metaphysics in the text and in the footnotes.
Thank you so much, Ian. The paper is really a fascinating one. I would commend it very strongly to anyone who's interested, because there's much more of real interest in it than Ian has been able to cover in this rather truncated presentation. But I fear now that we have to move away from Ian, but I'm happy to say that what we're moving to is a presentation by Raphael. And if I can just introduce him briefly, Raphael Sassower is professor of philosophy at the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs, and council chair of the CU President's Teaching Scholars Program. His latest book, The Spectre of Hypocrisy, was published in 2020, and his title, as announced today, is Pedagogical Perils and Promises of Critical Rationalism. Raphael.
Thank you very much. I will start by referring to Lydia's talk yesterday, who had the same predicament that I have, which is being assigned a topic by Nimrod and having to say that I don't think I have anything to say about the subject matter, only to find out, like Lydia about Agassi's ethics and morality, that if Agassi has done anything philosophical, it has always been pedagogical as well. That is, I don't think there's anything in his writing or thinking that did not include the question of teaching and learning and the question of transmitting knowledge, whether it's about, as we just heard from Ian, about metaphysics or about methodological individualism, that did not include a close relationship either with some of his students or a way of thinking way beyond the limits of philosophical writing in isolation. I always have, as I look back at some of his books and papers, understood him to have been a pedagogue. Again, of course, I have some critical things to say about it, but at heart, someone who is really concerned with how knowledge has been and continues to be transmitted from one person to the other, from one generation to the other, or from one group of thinkers, a school of thinking to the other. So that's kind of a starting point. I will also do what Ian has done and truncate my paper and just read a few what I think are salient points that are worth mentioning, and then a couple of paragraphs. One of Agassi's foci is the question of democratizing institutional settings. And I would suggest that the university, or the K through 12, as we call it in the United States, teaching, I would exclude the yeshiva for a minute, need and require a thorough rethinking of how to democratize, or what it would even mean to be taught or be instructed or grow up in a more democratic setting rather than the one we're usually used to in academic settings. The reason that he gives for it, and this is a quotable quote, is avoiding avoidable suffering. And he repeats this mantra in many of his writings to remind people that there are unavoidable suffering one goes through in life, whether for natural and external causes, or whether inflicted in the process of being trained to do something. I think he would probably talk about his personal experiences as a paratrooper and a paratrooper instructor, that there might be some kind of unavoidable fear, trepidation, maybe falling on the wrong side and hurting oneself, and avoidable and avoiding avoidable suffering that is not inflicting suffering willy-nilly or inflicted in a way that one can think better of that. This, of course, sets him up thinking about pedagogy or education of contrasting, which is again a typical pedagogical method that Agassi uses, is trying to set up contrasts or paradoxes in order to sharpen the place where one ends up thinking through and figure out an alternative. And that is between authoritarian education, as he calls it, and self-education. And that kind of contrast, again, runs throughout his writing about pedagogy, whether he's speaking directly about it or alluding to it while talking about something else, not only in his autobiographical work about his relationship with Popper or other people. To sharpen that question, now I refer back to the conversation we heard yesterday between Nati and Yehezkeli about the issue of autonomy. Another way of phrasing it is how to have both the authority of the expert, if one may call it an expert, and respecting the autonomy of the student, of the patient. And I think that yesterday's conversation between Nati and Yehezkeli ended up with some concession. That's what I heard or wanted to hear from Yehezkeli about compromised autonomy. There is a process that might be true both for psychiatric treatment and for pedagogy, which have a certain parallel structural and institutional settings, that there are points in which there is an unavoidable exertion of some kind of authority without becoming authoritarian. And I think these are kind of slight distinctions, but a lot rides on it. The next point that I want to kind of mention is that I thought one of the most fruitful ways in which Agassi speaks directly to what would be an idealized or an ideal situation is the one he develops with Ian when they talk about the apprenticeships in a workshop. And the notion of a apprenticeship, that there is a master, there is an expert with whom you're studying and whose skill set, as we call it today, you want to absorb or learn from or master yourself, but also the notion of a workshop, which they both developed in great detail in terms of and again, that reverts back to the first point that I raised about the democratizing that kind of institutional setting in which the student or the apprentice may teach the master as much as the master is learning from the student or the apprentice as the apprentice is learning from the master. And in Ian's talk this morning, we heard again where the apprentice, Yehezkeli, speaking to Popper, the master, is trying to teach, but I wasn't sure that Popper's study was exactly a workshop in which Popper was open and willing to listen to some young Israeli, probably not as well behaved as Popper would expect him, either from a Germanic or British background. So that leads me to, and I'm going to read this passage to a sixth point. But now it seems that the pedagogical problem set that Agassi sets up, I think if I kind of put together some of his collection of writing about it, is threefold. Lack of respect for students is one of the problem sets. Authoritarian institutional settings. And the third, avoidable suffering by students and perhaps even some teachers, especially those with precarious academic contracts, as we see around us. The putative solution is threefold as well. Undermine and reconfigure pedagogical rules with full participation of all involved, students and teachers alike. Institutionalize a workshop-like schooling system where students apprentice to become masters, and infuse individualized instruction with a heavy dose of critique and self-criticism. One wonders, though, of course, about two logical predicaments. Can one institutionalize individuals' learning, and will the avoidance of one harm not bring about another in its stead? And I think that, to me, remains an open question and one that is not as clear. We hear here and there allusions, and this is where what Malachi said yesterday kind of resonated as I was writing this paper, is that Agassi in some ways has left the yeshiva, but is still a member of it, even in some weird, I should say, a background information sense. The best thing I ever heard from Agassi say about the yeshiva is that he admired the fact that people learned there for the love of God, that there was no instrumentalizing that kind of education or that kind of rigorous disputation about the minutiae of textual interpretation. They weren't getting rich doing that. Okay, it didn't lead to a job through Harvard on Wall Street, but it was really done for the love of it. And that is one of those things that I remember wondering about, both as a student and now as a teacher, the kind of pushback against the neoliberal institutionalization of higher education as not simply job creation, but improvement of job prospects. And I think that Agassi was very clear from the very start. And we heard it yesterday as well in Lydia's talk about the certain joy of studying, the fun of figuring out certain things or discovering new text or unearthing a connection one didn't have before. And I think that is, again, oddly enough, I heard it from Agassi about the yeshiva much more than about, let's say, Boston University at the time, with a dictator, authoritarian dictator as a president who was Silber. I want to read another couple of passages. The dynamics and tensions, rather than paradoxes, of education may partially be fueled by a common sense recognition of the difference between existing knowledge and the unknown. They may be also partially fueled by exploration of the love of it. Without a telos or purpose, without the shadow of instrumentalization. What may look like an anarchistic pedagogy from one perspective may look like from another the perfect recipe for expanding and institutionalizing knowledge workshops. Perhaps this view of education could also bridge the patronizing divide between scientific and non-scientific knowledge, between expert and folk knowledge, between science and magic. Socrates confessed the limits of his knowledge in his trial. Must one face the hemlock to do the same? So far, two themes emerge in Agassi's pedagogical convictions, or what could also be described as the pedagogy of critical rationalism, the brainchild of the Popperian School of Philosophy, History, Sociology, and Methodology of Science. The first collapses philosophy and education, suggesting that engagement in the one is by definition an engagement in the other. You cannot teach without being philosophically informed, and philosophizing is inherently a mode of teaching. The second is an ideological commitment to open-ended inquiry, where the ideal is a collaborative workshop that explores the rules of the game as it is played out. The prestige and privilege accorded to the scientific community is questioned in this framework with an anticipated goal of improving the intellectual output of its members, freeing them to think creatively and heretically. What for the Kuhnian is considered revolutionary science, where all paradigms are discarded for new ones, is envisioned by critical rationalists to be normal science. In this sense, the reformist agenda of education is a wolf in sheep's clothing. Anarchist radicalism can erupt at any moment, revealing an underground pedagogical revolution beneath a piecemeal changes in its institutional framework. So what I'm suggesting is that despite the facade of friendliness and of reformist and of piecemeal changes, there is something much more radical about changing not only the contours and the rules of pedagogical transmission, but also how it can unleash certain creativity among students that otherwise would be overly contained. So in conclusion, even when philosophers have refrained from directly addressing pedagogical questions, they have tacitly endorsed views of modes of what and how knowledge should be transmitted from one group to another or from one generation to the next. Because Agassi is explicit about the structural predicaments and promises of a pleasant model of education workshop, he deserves critical assessment.
Thank you so much. Could people indicate with hands if they'd like to come in on this, please? Lydia. Lydia, you need to.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much, Raphael, for this or this lecture on education, which of course, as this topic is huge in Agassi's views and life, it's very hard in 20 minutes to do that. Let me just say something, not to take away from Agassi's originality, of course, but just to enhance educational thought in general in this context. A notable precursor could be the third Earl of Shaftesbury, who did for the Enlightenment something that Agassi tries to do for the 20th and 21st century, which was to educate a new class of citizens by making philosophy education itself. And that what I think is most close to critical rationalism in a way, that he proposed that you further your rationality by using it, and that you criticize each other. You propose to use humor and wit to do that, so that people would be less offended by the criticism, and that they would actually actively use ridicule in order to test truth, which in a way I think that Ian Jarvie and Joseph Agassi offered in the book on aesthetics, that we can use defunct art in order to see what values, ideas are ridiculed. So this is one precursor. But of course, I think that Michel de Montaigne, who of course influenced Hume a lot, by the fact that he was essaying his judgment again and again, and he could begin anywhere on any topic. So this, when you come to any of Agassi's workshops at his house, or people around him, you can see that it's always the case. It's true that Montaigne did it on his own. Agassi does it like Socrates did in groups. But I think it's a notable precursor as well, and that influenced also the third Earl of Shaftesbury, I now discovered.
Thank you. Do you want to come back on that, or Yosef?
No, thank you. I appreciate that parallel view between the Enlightenment and Agassi. Thank you.
Okay, I've got Bill Bergson next. Is that your hand coming up, Yoska?
Yes, but let Bill talk first. It's all right.
Okay, Bill.
Bill, you're...
Yes,
You're
I'm
muted.
muted. Sorry. I should be unmuted now. I wanted to mention or bring up again what seems to be relevant from yesterday, the issue of autonomy and degrees of autonomy. It seems to me that there's no absolute autonomy, and there's a mixture always of autonomy and interdependence and dependence. And these mixture, getting it right, is the issue. And sometimes that involves limits on autonomy are sometimes good. For example, in this very Zoom call, we are dependent on, first of all, the Zoom technology, but then also on Jeremy's wise supervision of us here. Ordering who can talk when. And I would suggest that constraints and limits on autonomy are also extremely valuable. They can be overdone, but so can autonomy. If we only were all talking at once, we couldn't have a good Zoom discussion. Similarly, I would say in pedagogy, one responsibility of adults is to set a curriculum which will prepare children to have essential skills and knowledge that they need for their life as adults, and to inform the children that this is what they need and help them to get it. So, there's a mixture of autonomy and dependence and constraint I think in good education and in other topics.
I want to, if I may, Yoska, before you respond, just quickly say something. The first semester I taught at my current university, I did an Agassi move that almost got me fired. And There's a course, I don't remember the course, probably Philosophy of Science, and I showed up first day of class and I said, well, we have a semester to spend together. I have no syllabus. Why don't you go for a week to the library, figure out which books you'd like to read in this general area called Philosophy of Science. We'll meet next week. We'll put together a syllabus together, and then we'll figure out what to do. The students promptly went to the chair to complain about my unpreparedness and my lack of competence, and suggested that I will be removed from either teaching the course or from the department in general. Thank God the chair was a very soft-hearted Marxist who became a deep ecologist, who said, Rafi, you can do this, and did not want to discuss the pedagogical rubric, the reasons, the philosophy behind it. And sure enough, I put together a syllabus in an hour and everything was covered.
Okay, Yehezkeli?
First of all, I want to thank Rafi most sincerely. Certainly, I'm more radical in education than people assume, because I don't insist on my radical idea. But my radical idea, to put it simply, is there are certificates and there are diplomas. I think certificates are decorations and should not be taken seriously, but diplomas should. Now, what requires a diploma and what not is a matter, a political matter. For example, in Switzerland, you need a diploma to be a clockmaker or even a clock seller. In other countries, not. So it is a matter of the polity, not of education as such. But diplomas show that we are serious, that we don't allow, say, a quack to behave like a doctor. This is the paradigm, but it can apply everywhere. This is certainly very interesting and very important. I also think, for example, that teachers, university teachers included, should grade students and should tell them what the grades are. But I think to tell the university how you grade the student is a betrayal of trust. I did it because it was my livelihood, but I always thought it was a betrayal. It's no business of the university how I grade my students. It's business of my students. Thank you.
Okay. Michael, I have you next. You're muted.
You are muted, Michael.
Okay, now you can hear. Just following what Raphael said, I just wanted to say that I did the same thing in my university, and it worked very well. And I wasn't accused of being ignorant. Actually, it brought many interested students to my courses. So here, at least, it worked well. That's it.
Chen, unmute.
Yeah, thank you very much. First of all, I ask all of your forgiveness. I was listening all along, but since I was in unfriendly environments, I had to shut myself up, and also the photography, the video part. And secondly, Michael, I wanted to say that I have heard that there are a few people in the world that implement Agassi's methods of education and go unpunished. And I'm thrilled to just have met one of them. Thank you very much. I have to tell you.
Let me just add, if I may.
Yes.
Just let me add, if I may, that a colleague of mine is now doing what I was doing. It was reported to me by my students. I said I was the only one doing that. And students told me, no, there is somebody doing the same as you are doing. So we are the two of us.
So two in one stone.
Yes.
This is lovely. And if I can add one thing to this lovely discussion, which is so much up my alley, I would say, if somebody would ask me what is Agassi's philosophy of education in a nutshell, I would say, and Agassi, I would be thankful if you confirm or deny what he once said to me, that for him, the optimal classroom would be a classroom where you could not tell the difference between teacher and student.
If I may add just one thing, I should mention Janusz Korczak, who is my master in all matters of education. And he said the first rule of education is for all teachers to respect every student.
And there, most of us fail.
If I may just add a couple of comments. One, I want to come back to, so first of all, Michael, thank you for confirming that it's possible. I think here's where we get to some problem of radicalism, and that is this kind of pedagogical gesture can be applied in different institutional settings. That is, it's one thing to come to a group of graduate students and say we're supposed to study about X and then work with them through a curriculum, and that to me is much easier than when you go to undergraduate students who have less of a sense of autonomy and less of a sense, because their biggest, at least in the United States, their biggest accomplishment might have been graduating from high school. So I think it also depends on the context, it depends on the institutional setting, it depends on the students that you're dealing with. But this also brings me back to the question, which Bill, I think you're absolutely right, have to come back to the question of what it means to deal with compromised autonomy. There is no absolute autonomy in any sense. Yes, Korczak starting point of respect for, that's not the end of the story. The end of the story is, what are we trying to do here when we're learning something, or when we're trying to teach something? Or to go all the way to Agassi's point, when we're trying to give someone a diploma, where we're certifying that you are capable of treating patients, or that you're capable of teaching engineering and making sure that the engineers you're training are going to actually build bridges that will not collapse. So there's a certain level of what Nati talked about yesterday, of compromised autonomy. Now, is the student autonomous to give up their autonomy? Now that becomes a more interesting question, and to what extent they're doing it consciously, to what extent they're doing it coercively, that's a different story. I think in that sense, we all agree that when we, in the privilege, sanctity of higher education, can tell an undergraduate or graduate student, you came here voluntarily, if you don't want to be here, you can leave. That's a completely different conversation when you have mandatory K through 12 education and the student is coerced into going to this place calling school and being schooled. So I think that I don't want to generalize without really being very specific about the context, about the institutional setting, about the legal parameters, about the political ramification, about funding, about all these other things that I think are much more important than any kind of individualized respect we ought to show to not only students, but to any human being in our surrounding.
Thank you so much. I fear that our time has caught up with us, in the sense that we have at the moment a 10-minute brief break. The topic is obviously one on which we could go on discussing for a long time, and do feel free during this break period, if people so wish, to continue the conversation. But we need to have a formal break just to allow people, if they need to go and get a coffee or a drink of water or other things. Again, thank you so much, Raphael. And also Ian for his contribution in the first part.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you all.
עד שאתה מקיים, ב-education, זה פרקי אבות, יהיה כבוד תלמידך חביב עליך כשלך.
וזה רוב המרצים לא מקיימים.
ודאי.
להביא אותו להם מים קפה.
I have, if Yoska is still here, a brief memory connected with this. When I was at the LSE, the students set up a philosophy society called the Symposium. The reason for doing it was that they discovered that if they set up a society, they could get money from the Students' Union in order to buy wine with. I suggested to them that if the society existed, it would be very good to have some speakers, and indeed we did so. One of the speakers we had was Yehezkeli, and I was in touch with him about what he might talk about, and he said very kindly, well, it's up to you. So I decided and let him know that we'd bill him on the philosophy of social science. And so we advertised this. We had the so-called new theater at the time in the East Building at the LSE was really pretty full of people. Yehezkeli came in, sat on the bench facing the students and said, have you got any questions?
Jeremy, I met Yehezkeli for the first time doing the same performance in the military. I was in officers course, and I guess we had to have speakers once or twice. And I think Yehezkeli, it was his military reserve duty. And this crazy man shows up, and not only does he sit on the bench, he turns on his transistor to classical music. And he said, we have two options. If you have questions, I can answer them, or we can listen to music. And, you know, in a military setting, that was really, really crazy.
And yet they didn't punish me, but they invited me to many places to talk for many years.
I should say that some members of the audience for that reacted in a rather hostile way, but still. And I should further say that it was towards me as the chair rather than, but still, these things happen.
Yes, there was one student who said there was a promise of a lecture and he came to listen to a lecture, and so I'm obliged to lecture to him. So I asked him if he ever went to the movies and saw a movie he didn't like. And after a few exchanges, he realized, he stood up and walked out.
Yes, he was a lecturer in sociology, it should be said.
Yes.
Yeah. I'm sorry.
Just wanted to draw your attention that there's an interesting exchange on metaphysics between Jeremy and Adam Kamilevsky in the chat. People may want to look, and perhaps, Jeremy, there were a number of other comments there from the audience. I'm wondering whether there's a way in which we can give some role to the audience when they ask the questions. I know we are very short on time, and we try to privilege the panelists, but it would be nice if sometimes, I mean, the people from the audience manage to also advance their ideas.
I'll call on people from that if they put the thing basically as a question to, or a directed as a comment directed specifically to the speaker.
Okay.
But it certainly is worth checking out the chat on that, and there are a range of issues being raised. I'll actually, because the exchange with Adam referred to a reference which I couldn't give him. I'll just look that up and type that in. Excuse me.
If I'm allowed to say something about anti-metaphysics.
Sure.
First of all, there's no question that, like every field, metaphysics is mostly poor. We can say this also of poetry, we can say this of literature, we can say this of most educational literature. For example, if you take books on electrodynamics, you'll find that although they more or less repeat each other, most of them are not very good, but some of them excels. And that's the usual thing. And most of people who attack metaphysics give examples of bad metaphysics. And I think they should not be contradicted, because really there is enough bad metaphysics. And of course, my paradigm is Heidegger. So to say that 80% or 90% of metaphysics is poor is no argument, because the same holds for almost every field of human activity. What is really at issue here is that the first idea of anti-metaphysics of Bacon was that people use their imagination wildly and therefore can make mistakes, which is irresponsible. So as long as you think that mistakes are kinds of irresponsibility, you have to become more or less, demand as little talking as possible. Popper began his lecture courses in the London School of Economics always by saying, there's the saying that words are gold, but words are silver, but silence is gold. And he said, if this were so, I wouldn't be talking to you. And he said, scientists talk a lot, and they talk a lot because they have problems to solve and exchange opinions.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, do continue, because I was going to say that we'll need to start soon the next session. But carry on, Yehezkeli.
I want to conclude by saying some people said we are unimaginative and some people said we are too imaginative. And this is what Popper says about boldness. It's very hard to be imaginative, but you can try.
Thanks very much. Is Raphael with us yet? If not, no, I'm sorry. I was misreading. Our next speaker is going to be Michael.
That's right.
That's fine.
If I get permission.
What a nice cat. Okay. Are you ready to go ahead shortly? I'll just give you a formal introduction. Okay. Our next speaker is Michael Segre. He recently retired from the chair of history of science at the D'Annunzio University, Chieti. He lives in the North Italian countryside and is currently writing his memoirs, which include accounts of over half a century of working with Joseph Agassi. He is talking to us today on Agassi's contribution to the history of science.
Well, thank you very much, Jeremy. and thanks for having invited me to this meeting, this most interesting meeting. Well, let me begin most humbly with one of Agassi's most important contributions to the history of science. He introduced me to the field. It all started when I had to choose a subject for my master's thesis in the history of philosophy of science. I asked Yosef's advice, and he suggested that I consider the debate following Alexander Koiré's rejection of the hoary belief that Galileo had been the father of experimental science. Since Koiré's work is relevant to Agassi's contribution to the history of science, let me begin with a few words on Koiré. In 1939, Koiré opened a new era in Galilean studies and in history of science in general, taking the assumption that science was primarily an intellectual enterprise. He conjectured that experiment did not play an essential role in Galileo's work, and even suggested that some experiments which Galileo described in detail had never been performed. Koiré frankly admitted that his claim was rooted in philosophy, or more precisely in metaphysics, since he believed that experiments are generally no more than embodiments of a priori theories. Koiré further suggested that errors committed by scientists can be much more enlightening for the historiography of science than their success. Naturally, Koiré's claim aroused opposition. The belief refuses to die that Galileo's contribution to methodology constituted in direct contact with nature in astronomy and physics alike, in contradiction to the allegedly bookish natural philosophy of the medieval age. Admittedly, unlike the easily refutable later claim, the metaphysical basis of Koiré's intriguing and original claim makes a rebuttal much harder. Koiré, however, opened the door for a new historiography of science, emphasizing aspects including the importance of scientists' errors. Errors committed by scientists can say a lot about the questions they put to nature. Agassi's contribution to the history of science are very much in line with Koiré. Together with I.B. Cohen, Agassi is one of the few who highlight and contribute to the trend that considers science to be primarily an intellectual a priori enterprise. To be sure, Agassi criticizes Koiré for not having given sufficient emphasis to scientific controversies. He further considers many additional factors, social, anthropological, and even psychological, which influence science. Always bearing in mind metaphysical backgrounds, he tries to reconstruct what scientists did in the immediate context, rather than what they say that they did, and highlights aspects including the scientists' difficulties and skepticism. In general, one can say that Agassi simultaneously performed a microanalysis and a macroanalysis of the scientist's work, pointing out complexity, raising questions and criticizing previous histories of science. I'm certain that if Agassi's claim had to be checked one by one, the history of science would look very different. For my part, at least, I was able to verify them in my studies of Galileo and his follower, particularly Torricelli. Close reading of the description of Torricelli's famous quicksilver experiment and other of his works show that his image as an experimentalist has been fabricated and should be corrected. The same can be said, of course, about Galileo, confirming Koiré. A central question tackled by Agassi is, why does early history of science, of modern science, place so much emphasis on induction as the method of science? His answer is, it is merely rhetorical, the consequence of an ideology that followed the scientific revolution. It has little to do with the actual methodology or even epistemology and metaphysics of the main figures of the scientific revolution. It is rather the outcome of a widespread and not necessarily correct interpretation of Bacon's influential philosophy of science. Indeed, Bacon's philosophy too is much more a prioristic than is generally presented, since it suggests posing questions and eliminating the wrong answers till the correct one is reached. Now, since Agassi welcomes criticism, let me point out one aspect he apparently neglected, the practical approach of Renaissance technicians who, after all, contributed consistently to the scientific revolution and to some Renaissance literary traditions at the root of the historiography of science. I have expounded this last point in a recent long article on the dawn of scientific biography, just published by Early Modern Science. Despite all this, the view of science as empirically laden has predominated in the history of science, starting from the earliest Renaissance Baroque biography of Galileo, recently, by the way, translated into English by Stefano Gattei, up to the recent confused postmodern histories of science. The British empirical ideology experienced terrific success and even cornered the continental Cartesian rationalism, mainly thanks to popularizers such as Voltaire or Algarotti. There remained, therefore, much space to fill. Agassi had already undertaken this challenge in his doctoral dissertation by considering a number of central issues in the history of science, beginning with Bacon's philosophy of science, moving through Boyle's ideology, Newton's declared methodology, influential but misleading, and Faraday's emancipating enterprise up to the quantum revolution. A noteworthy work in this direction is Agassi's book on Bacon and Boyle, which, as its title, The Very Idea of Modern Science Suggests, extends far beyond their contribution. It delves into the contradictions in Bacon's ideology and reveals the attempts by early history of modern science to gloss over them. Agassi's interesting and original explanation is socio-anthropological. Since early modern scientists were amateurs, they formed a sect. Sects have their taboos, and the creed of generations of researchers, scientists as well as philosophers and historians of science, was Bacon's inductivism, which they avoided criticizing. Boyle is a typical example. He both adopted Bacon's alleged views and at the same time struggled with them. Moreover, on the fringes of his study of Boyle and others, Agassi studies the development of the standards of priority, a topic repeatedly mentioned by the history of science, but never before properly historically researched. The same can be said concerning Faraday, an outstanding experimenter with limited mathematical abilities. In his studies of Faraday, Agassi brings a new dimension to the dawn of electromagnetism. He investigates the meanderings, courses of related experiment, as well as the controversies in the wake of different theories or metaphysical approaches. He highlights Faraday's hesitancies and skepticism neglected by the traditional history of science. He turns a lens on the interplay between theory and experiment, showing how these can hardly fit into a pre-established historiographical, or more precisely, ideological frame. He not only considers a variety of factors, such as philosophical and psychological influences on scientific investigation, but also does this at various levels: metaphysical, epistemological, methodological, methodical, and more. His conclusion, as far as Faraday is concerned, is that, and here I quote, Faraday viewed himself not as a discoverer, but as a theoretician, as well as an experimenter. He wanted to be known as a philosopher. Success or failure was for him the success or failure of his speculation about the nature of things physical, success or failure to attain the critical notice of his colleagues. End of quotation. Like Boyle, however, Faraday strove to conform with Bacon's alleged views while simultaneously struggling with them. Agassi shows Agassi shows how the inductivist fable of Faraday and of other scientists was continued even when the more speculative, hypothetical aspects of science became evident during the 19th century. Even then, scientists and historians glossed over the metaphysical shift and followed the inductive creed in their fear of disagreeing with past giants. It took a figure of Justus Liebig's stature to openly criticize Bacon's view of science. Only gradually did the struggle with the problem of induction lose its relevance as a driving force. It was nonetheless replaced in more recent history of science by considerations, so to speak, of professionalism, which replaces the term empiricism with practice, showing that Leopard has not quite changed its spots. Much the same can be said when reading Agassi's history of the radiation theory, and I do not understand why Yehezkeli claims this book was a flop. It is a mine of suggestions related to the dawn of the quantum theory that merit closed inspection. Among them, Agassi's claim that Kirchhoff's law is much more relevant to quantum theory than was presented till the appearance of the book. To end this short paper, Yehezkeli has been appointed honorary professor at my University of Chieti Pescara. Let me end by pointing out one neglected contribution of his to the teaching of history of science. Having been unable to find any readable textbook for the subject, I recommend Agassi's The Continuing Revolution, A History of Physics from the Greek to Einstein, to my student both at undergraduate level and at graduate level. The book was written many years ago in the form of a dialogue with Aaron as a child. It has been translated into Italian, and much to the satisfaction of Armando, the publisher, which keeps reprinting and selling the book, it has been an unprecedented success. It shows how great ideas written in a simple way are much more didactically effective than hundreds of confused pages, however acclaimed and praised they may be. Thank you very much. I finished.
Thanks so much, Michael. Could people indicate again by raising a hand if they'd like to come into the conversation? I haven't got a hand so far, so could I pose a question to Michael and Yehezkeli, which is this. At the LSE, when I studied there, we were recommended Yehezkeli's book on towards the historiography of science. Amongst the other things which we looked at was Burt's book, The Metaphysical Foundations of Modern Physical Science. Michael stressed quare. Did Burt's book, which was earlier, have any impact at all, really?
Let me say, first of all, Burt's book is 1925, and it was a flop, and it appeared again in 1950, and it was an enormous success. That's a remarkable event or two events to compare with each other. I asked Bert if his book has anything to do with the Einsteinian revolution, so he smiled very benignly and said, possibly. So this is a very interesting fact. What Bert did, which was so remarkable, is to say that Newton was a poor methodologist. Not that he was mistaken or that he was right, but his writing on scientific methods are not very interesting. Bert wanted to show that without the modern metaphysics, there would be no physics. To what extent he succeeded is really a question on which there is a debate between parties. The pro-metaphysics think that he did a magnificent job, including me, and those who are against it still poo-poo the book. The book is, I think, a milestone. It's very important, but there's almost no discussion of it.
Thank you. I've got Raphael next.
Thank you, Michael, for this contribution. And the last mention you said about the dialogue between Yehezkeli and Aaron, again, to me, exemplifies the notion of pedagogical processes that go no matter what subject or area you're working on or in.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Raphael. Just answering your question, Jeremy, about the two books you mentioned. The problem is that the two books have not been translated into Italian. And when I complained in a department meeting that our students do not speak enough English and one should teach them a little more English, a colleague stood up and said, first of all, we have to teach them to speak Italian. So, sorry.
No problem. Any other questions or comments? Either here or from the group in the seminar format?
No questions.
I think John has a question, huh? I see a hand. I see John has raised a hand.
Really, I can't see a hand. Sorry, if there is a hand, please speak.
I see it. I see it.
Oh, John,
No,
sorry.
I don't have a hand. I have nothing to say.
Sorry.
Okay.
Sorry. Sorry, it was a ghost. Sorry.
Okay. Could I then ask Yehezkeli a question? Could you say something about the reception of Towards an Historiography of Science?
Yes, certainly. I can say that. First of all, it was my first publication. It was the first thing I did. I left London in 1960. I went to Hong Kong. And as soon as I landed there, I started writing the historiography of science. I wrote it as a paper, and people said one has to give examples. And so it became a slim volume, 108 pages, 118 pages, and it was published as an issue of a periodical. Now it's a part of a book, Science and its History, but then it was just a volume. And to my amazement, there were dozens of reviews of it. And it doesn't matter whether they were favorable or unfavorable. The fact that so many people wrote lengthy and detailed reviews of a book written by an unknown impressed me very much. The most remarkable review was of Tom Kuhn, who both called me a plagiarist and brilliant. That I liked very much.
A brilliant plagiarist. You need to know who to steal from.
Maybe, yes. That is Galileo's pride. Galileo said, Rossi accuses me of theft, but at least I'm, according to him, a theft with good taste. That's Galileo.
But sorry.
Jeremy, if I may add?
Yes.
I think it does matter if the reviews were friendly or hostile, and they were, Yehezkeli, I think you will confirm, on the whole, very hostile. And on the whole, not all of them. And you hit a nerve, what can I say? That's it.
The most impressive part of my historiography of science was the first page. The middle of the page was one paragraph in which I say that Bacon described the scientists as right. And of course, once you describe people as right and wrong, you very comfortably find yourself on the right. And that impressed people. But I think Stefano wants to say something on this.
No, sorry, I just was moving my hand, but no, exactly. I remember that page very, very well.
I was just wondering, Yehezkeli, when if Kuhn was saying that it was brilliant and also plagiarism, was he suggesting that it was plagiarism of himself? Because that is quite a nice way to give oneself a compliment.
That is quite possible, but I don't think so. You see, Kuhn had a difficulty. He spoke of mature fields as those which have a paradigm, namely a consensus, a core of consensus. And he wanted to be the paradigm of philosophy. So he expressed agreement with everybody, with Karl, with Popper, with me, and so on. He agreed with everybody because he wanted to be the paradigm. Unfortunately, this was not successful. I don't know why. It was very near to be a success. The book was published in many languages and in many editions. It is, I think, the most successful book in the philosophy of science of the century. Speaking of numbers of times that it was published, languages and so on, by any criteria. And yet he was always very frustrated. And he was an unhappy person. What can I say? I regret it very much.
Michael.
Yes, one question to Yehezkeli. I really would like to know why are you so unhappy about your book on the theory of radiation? Why do you consider it a flop? I don't understand.
One review of it or two, and it didn't sell. Nowadays it's on the web, you can download it, but it didn't sell, and there were no comments on it. And I didn't find people influenced by it. I don't know.
That's not.
I can't say more. I don't know.
I've just
Yes.
I've just got a tiny indication that amongst the comments that have come up are towards an historiography have changed my life, and then there's a reference to something, and also a link to the review of Kuhn is available there if people have missed that. I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
No, you didn't.
Any further comment? Raphael.
A quick one, Yehezkeli, if you can talk a little bit about the Faraday book that Michael mentioned. If I remember correctly, at some point you said that one of the things that impressed you about him, that he was a nobody and that he didn't come from the upper classes and didn't have the kind of the gentleman of science that what's his name talks about so much, and that he was also interested in public education and evening classes and demonstration to a broader audience, and that what made him for you an interesting character to study.
Certainly. First of all, his most popular things were his public lectures, and people said as an example that women bought new hats in order to go to his lectures. He fascinated people. He had a very agreeable voice. He had a very agreeable way of talking. And yes, he came from the lower class. Already his predecessor, Humphrey Davy, or Sir Humphrey Davy, came, as the Britannica says, from humble walks of life. I like it, from a humble walk of life. His father was a carpenter in southwest England somewhere, in a remote place. And the interesting thing is that people who were poor and not from the upper class and who did some scientific researches usually needed a patron to support them financially and to help them publish their ideas. Perhaps the most significant example is of the $100 note. Who is on the $100 note?
Franklin?
Franklin. Benjamin Franklin. Thank you. I'm sorry, I'm stuck. Benjamin Franklin reports that when he wrote his paper on the lightning, which is really a major contribution to science, he sent it to a fellow of the Royal Society in America, and this fellow hesitated and kept the manuscript a few months before he sent it on. And Franklin could not forgive him for the rest of his life. This is a very interesting fact, although Franklin was a very agreeable person and very mild and forgiving.
I fear now that we have again come to the end of a session in respect of which I think our discussion could go on, but I need now to call on our next speaker. You're ready for me to introduce you, are you, Chen? Okay.
I'm here.
Yes, that is great. Our next speaker is Yehezkeli. Dr. Yehezkeli is a philosopher of political science and of education. He published Close Education in the Open Society with Brill in 2012. He is the initiator of the coming Congress for Civil Solidarity in Israel. And I'm happy now to introduce his talk to us. Chen.
Thank you, Jeremy, and thank you all. I must open by saying I'm humbled. I'm a man of very little learning, generally so, and especially in comparison to present company. So maybe I should also ask for your forgiveness for any expressions of that lacuna in my life, but let me begin. My talk is about the question of Agassi's contribution to the implementation of critical rationalism to political studies. And to say what his contribution is very short. I will say it now, and that is what I came here to say. Agassi claims, and for all I know, he's the first one to do so, that the civil nation or civil nationality or civil nationhood, or call it what you like, is a necessary pre-requirement of democracy. In other words, you cannot have democracy without it. Now, to stress Agassi, and to say the obvious, of course, Agassi did not invent civil nationalism. The invention of civil nationalism goes back to the fathers of the French and the American revolutions. Incidentally, Agassi calls them the French and the American Revolution in the singular, to stress that these two revolutions are indeed one. And I must admit, this is a very appealing idea. And there's also evidence, of course, that this invention was way more far-reaching than the people who instigated it were aware of. Just to think that so many of them were slave owners and that they did not feel, or at least they did not express any awareness that this in any way contradicts their own ideas. Not to mention that all of them were married to women who had no rights, and so on, and so some of them were anti-Semites, and so on. So there's good indication to suggest that they were not aware of how far-reaching their own invention was. And the way I like to think about it, at least in the United States, but I think also in other places in the world, of course France, but also other places, is that they wrote a check and they were not completely aware of what was written in the check. And this check would not have yielded any reform or any progress in civil and political affairs, was it not for people who came afterwards and who demanded that the check would be cashed. I'm talking about civil rights figures in the United States and Canada most impressively, and in other places in the world. Now, there are several questions here wanting to be asked, and I would be happy if you would help me determine between them. One of them is to talk about why indeed is the question of minimal requirements or minimal desiderata or minimal platform, or call it what you like, why must it be considered, as I say it must, an inherent part of critical rationalism? Why? How does it follow from the basic premises of critical rationalism, which of course I say that it does? This is one question which I think maybe we do not need to talk about it, because at least for the present company, it might be too obvious to warrant any words. Another question is, what is civil nationalism? For many of us, we take it for granted in many countries, but even those of us who take it for granted are often at a loss of words when they are asked, what is it? And I think this could prove to be a productive line of conversation, of looking into. Another question is indeed civil nationalism prerequisite, a minimal prerequisite? Minimal, I do not mean that it is small, I mean that it is evidently necessary, that it is obviously indispensable for democracy, which Agassi says that it is. With your permission, I will start with the last question, because this is the one that concerns me personally the most, being that in Israel we don't have it, and that Israel is in a very tough spot on far more than one count, as we all know. And the only contribution that Agassi makes here, or the one that I'm pointing at any rate, is that these two facts are intimately linked. The fact that Israel has no civil nationality, or to be more precise, to put it in technical terms, Israel does not recognize its own civil nation. In more blunt words, Israel does not recognize the Israeli nation. I don't know how many of the non-Israelis here have ever noticed this odd fact about Israel, but it is a fact, it's not an opinion. Israel does not recognize the Israeli nation, and it is strange to say that Israel recognizes, by the way, the Jewish nation, which according to existing standards and criteria, I mean, such standards and criteria that are accepted worldwide in political science, does not exist. I mean, the Jewish nation, there's no such thing as a Jewish nation in the political sense of the term. There are many other terms, senses by which people use the word nationality. This is a minefield, of course, but in the strict political sense, There's no such thing as the Jewish nation, and Israel recognizes that non-existent nation. The same goes with the Arab nation. Israel recognizes the Arab nation, which does not exist, but Israel does not recognize the Israeli nation. And most Israelis, I mean the vast majority of Israelis, go along with that. In other words, most Israelis themselves do not recognize the Israeli nation. So this is one observation, and the other observation, as I said, is that Israel is in a very, very tight spot on many fronts. And Agassi's contribution in this respect is that these two observations are so intimate that they are almost one and the same. They are not completely one and the same, of course, because we do have other reasons for being in a tight spot. We are a country surrounded by enemies, as the extreme rightist wings of Israel politicians repeatedly say. They are right. What can I say? It costs my heart to bleed to acknowledge that they are right, but they are right. Now, the question is, how do we make this intimate link? Are we justified in doing so? And not only in regards to Israel, but generally so. And I put it to you what is, I think, again, an obvious observation among political scientists, that in all parts of the globe where we see what is commonly referred to as intractable conflicts, of which Israel and the Palestinian authority or Palestinian entity, I don't know how to refer to it, are an upstanding example, of course, an intractable conflict. In all places in the world where we see intractable conflicts, we see a lack of civil nationalism. More than that, in all places in the world where we see democracy dwindling, or democracy under attack, or democracy in danger of any kind, if we look, you know, the French phrase, help me please, cherchez la femme, am I saying it correctly? Look for the woman. Thank you, Lydia. So I say look for the absence of civil nationalism, or look for the presence of other kinds of nationalism, or more specifically of exclusive nationalism. Now, in order to go into the question why, what is the case for the statement that civil nationalism is required, is a prerequisite of democracy, we do need to say a few words, I feel, about what civil nationalism is. But before that, Jeremy, can you tell me how much time I got left?
Yes, certainly. You've got a clear 9 minutes, and then there's a further 10 minutes for discussion. So you can, if you're really pressed, go into that a bit of the discussion.
No, I'm perfectly okay, and thank you. Civil nationalism is opposed to, in literature, it's sometimes called ethnic nationalism, or traditional nationalism, or tribal nationalism, and there are probably other terms for that as well. And the main difference, or maybe I should say the main differences, there are, I think, about 3 between them, is one, civil nationalism is inclusive. It includes in it all the citizens of the state under question, whereas all other kinds of nationalism are exclusive. Of course, the most famous example is Nazism, and also white supremacism in the United States. They all call themselves nationalists now, and they call civil nationalists anti-nationalists, which highlights a very important point between the two versions or two variants of nationalism. And this is the fact that they are so dramatically opposed to one another that the members of each camp are seen as anti-nationalists by the members of the other camp. Kuhn mentioned something about the incommensurability thesis. Am I saying it correctly? Yeah. I don't know how, I don't want to make a case for Kuhn, but I think this is one of the few places where Kuhn was right. It is very difficult to communicate across border lines. But in this particular example, I said there's more than one difference. So one difference is that it is inclusive, whereas tribal or chauvinistic or whatever you call it, ethnic nationalism is exclusive. Another difference is that it is egalitarian or equalitarian. I never quite know which term to use, whereas ethnic nationalism is not. In principle, I mean, it's not a criticism, it's the way it is usually presented. And another difference, and maybe the one that encompasses all other differences, is that ethnic nationalism is based upon communal or religious or any other kind of affiliation and ignores citizenship, whereas civil nationalism is the exact opposite. It is based on citizenship and ignores any other kind of affiliation, which is often described as in saying that civil nationalism is based on the distinction between community and nationhood. Yes, we each in any given state, we each have our different community, but we all belong to one nation, as it says on the dollar bill, one nation under God. I think this is enough to state the dramatic difference between the two kinds of nationalism. And this poses an interesting philosophical question. I'm not forgetting that this is, at least in one respect, a philosophical conference. And there's a problem here, and I want to share it with you, a problem that I myself am struggling with. And it is this: the great merit of civil nationalism, at least in my view and in the view of some others, I think, Yoske, I got it from you, but I will not blame you for it, is that it is a defense against the other kinds maybe of nationalism. We need some kind of nationalism. We cannot do without it. Why? That's a different question, but this is a fact of life. Many of us don't feel this need, and all for the better for these people, but many of us do, most of us do. And we need something. So if we do not have civil nationalism, we are victims, we are gullible victims, we are in what's the term for it, risk group for becoming ethnic nationalists, which includes racism, fascism, and all the other not niceisms that there are. And civil nationalism is a buffer against all that. If it is a buffer against all that, it means that it fills the same need. So it's not so radically different after all, is it? That is, this is my curio here. There is something which is in common to both kinds, or to all kinds of nationalism. And I think that we need to be aware and to address both the similarities and the differences, because otherwise we will not do it justice. I know that I have a few minutes left, But Jeremy, if it's okay, I would gladly open the floor now.
That would be fine, because you could then come back to elaborate on a point in the event of questions. I've got Bill Berkson first.
Yes, first of all, thank you. This is really fascinating insight that sheds a lot of light, on the problems of Israel as well as other nations. One recent book which sort of dramatizes and adds to your thing is this book, The Narrow Corridor, by Acemoglu and Robinson. And they are two excellent historians from University of Chicago and Princeton. And their thesis is that the benefits of that the West has experienced of individual freedom and of economic growth, both are a result of a strong state and a strong civil society. And they trace the origin and development of both state and civil society being strong and interacting from about the year 500 up until now. And they say it's a dynamic process of constant struggle between the strong society, but all of these are nation states, I think. I think that's a premise, so to speak, of their book. And I would be, but what I think it could help you is that in the context of Israel, it shows that this is fractured, that this relationship between civil society and government is not coherent, is not well functioning in Israel. And this lies maybe at the problems. I mean, I don't pretend to know about Israel's problems, but from a distance, it looks like this may be well a characterization of what needs to be strengthened. At any rate,
you are way too gentle. What can I tell you? You say that the relationship between civil society and government in Israel is problematic. In Israel, there is no civil society. This is what I'm trying to say here. So, right. Of course, it is problematic. And I thank you for the recommendation of the book and for your insight. If I may add, first of all, also thank you for mentioning the term civil society, because it is an important term in literature and generally, and it means the same thing. We're talking about the same thing. I think there's no doubt about that. And if I may add, there are a few places that I saw. I think even in there's a formal definition given by the European Union of nationalism or of nationhood or nation. I'm not sure which, according to which the nation is the mediator or the go-between the government and the citizen. This opens up, I think this is a beautiful observation, and it opens up, of course, many, many interesting questions. But I think this observation is what you just echoed in what you said, and indeed, I go along with that. Thank you.
Okay, I've got Raphael and then Nathaniel after that. Raphael first.
I have two comments, one comment and one question. Comment is, you know that the critics who claimed that the cause of all evil, to put a blanket statement of problems we have seen in the last 50, 60 years, has been the notion of, or the emergence of the nation state, that its artificial composition is such that it defies more traditional forms of communal living, and therefore does more harm than good in its authoritarian way. So that's a comment. The question is that I tried to ask yesterday, maybe you can answer today, is so would you suggest then that one way of remedying what you find is to have the one-state solution rather than two-state solution between the Israelis and the Palestinians?
Raphael, I want to kiss you on both cheeks. What can I say? Maybe we should take a few steps backwards, with your permission, and say this, that the ideal that I think we all share is John Lennon's ideal of imagine all the people, yes, as cosmopolitism or universalism or the brotherhood of man, or as Agassi upgraded it, the siblinghood of humanity. I think this is what we all aspire towards, and that this should go without saying. It needs to be said, but I think now that it is said, this is where we're aiming at. And I would welcome a situation in which the entire humanity would be one big happy family. By the way, I don't know if you know, or I'm sure you know actually, that there are people who do not settle for that. They believe in solidarity, not only in the siblinghood, not only of humanity, but between all living creatures on earth. I am not joking. I'm not bringing it as a caricature. I'm saying I sympathize with them as well. It's called earthlingism. And even before it was called earthlingism, I think it was called Buddhism. And you see it in many places and in different cultures, and I completely sympathize with it. The question is, until we have that, what can we have in the meantime, or even to put it more bluntly, what can help us in that direction? And when people blame nationalism for standing in the way of that, I say this is a bit unperceptive. Unperceptive or imperceptive, I'm not sure. At any rate, there are two kinds of nationalism. One which promotes general or universal human values, and one which is opposed to them. And this is a black and white picture, and it is unbecoming in a philosophical conference to present a black and white picture, but this is the picture that I personally have, because I do believe that civil nationalism is a step in that direction. If I may give just one, possibly the most outstanding example in history, is the famous "I Have a Dream" speech by Martin Luther King. And I read it many times because it is an inspiring piece of work. And I noticed something in that speech that I didn't find mention of in any of the commentaries about it. And this is the fact that Martin Luther King sometimes in his speech talks as a Negro addressing other Negroes. Sometimes he speaks as an American addressing other Americans. And sometimes he speaks as a human being addressing the entire of humanity. And he makes the switches between these three phases without a blink of an eye, without saying it. And I think that this is the very message of the speech. Thank you.
Okay, I've got now Nathaniel. Could I also mention that I've got a couple of points raised by people in the wider group that I'd like to mention after that, and then I'd like to contribute myself. Nathaniel.
Okay, Chen, thank you so much for presenting Yehezkeli's idea so succinctly and clearly. I remember him working on these ideas together with Hillel Cook in the late 70s. And I don't remember anybody, including some intellectual leaders and political leaders, who was not impressed and taken by these ideas, but they all, almost all, said, these are very interesting and important ideas in theory. In theory. But who would accept it? When I asked them, would you? Said yes, but who else? And what would be the way to implement it? Do you have a way to implement it? That we talked yesterday about the gap between the theory and the practice. Here I want to come to another point, and it is the dichotomy that you present. The implementation here in Israel has been taking place bottom up. I want to be hopeful. Yesterday, Yoske talked about hope. I want to be hopeful because we do have a civil society. We don't have a civil nationality. We do have a civil society. And the ills of the civil society reflect much of the lack of the civil nationality. So we have a very sizzling, in the last 30 years, we have developed a sizzling civic society that is also suffering. And with this, I'm with you. And I would ask you, could you imagine how in Israel we implement this view, and the Palestinians have declared in their declaration that their state is under Allah is a master. We have neighbors, and by now we have created another problem that all Arab Israelis have become Palestinians by nationality. If they are Palestinians by nationality, not by nationality, but by nationality, just Israeli citizens with a Palestinian nationality. So their nationality complies with Allah is a master. Do you see a possibility that if we rush forward and implement this idea, could we see to it that it would not be abused in an extended way? And it has been, for example, the way Azmi Bashara preached for, or the way Sharon has endorsed it and invaded Lebanon in order to dislocate the Palestinians to move to Jordan. The same idea.
Thank you. I'm really thrilled. I'm really exuberant right now. And you also reminded me that I neglected one of Rafi's questions. Does my presentation point in the direction of the one-state solution? First of all, I want to make a comment about all questions in a generalization. The idea of civil nationhood or nationality in general, and this very idea in the Israeli context in specific, raises a myriad of questions. I once tried to list them down. The questions are so many that it is mind-boggling, including the question, do we need to replace our national anthem, for example? I'm not suggesting by no means that we discuss this question now, but this is another question that is raised, and the idea itself does not answer these questions. These questions we need to answer, and to that end, I have initiated recently, and I hope to invite you all soon to a Congress. It would be, of course, a Zoom Congress to discuss these very questions in an atmosphere that requires no agreement. This is another thing that I have learned, and I think we all have learned from Agassi, is that democracy, in contrast with common view, stands not on agreement, but on disagreement, or to be more exact, on the agreement to allow or to even welcome disagreement. So I don't have answers to most questions. The big question that unites many of these questions together is the question that you raised, Nati. Do you think it is possible? Or how is it possible, if at all? And my answer is that I do not know. I sincerely do not know. I know that many in Israel, I think, Nati, you mentioned it, many in Israel crave for this. And I have this optimistic notion that once we start this wagon rolling, people will want to jump on. But this raises the question, why did they not jump on when Agassi and Hillel talked about it? Why?
At that point, I'm going to have to stop you just because we've hit the end of the formal session. I did mention that there are a couple of contributions which I want to highlight, and what I would suggest then is we've got a basically a 20-minute break, slightly eroded into. We can, if we so wish, continue the discussion through a good bit of the break. But just to make sure I get these in, I have John Rock saying, Popper insisted that the nation state was a myth of the 19th century and that before that there were only multi-ethnic empires. This is an issue that Malachi was referring to. And also what he says, when do you make patriotic Israelis out of the Arab Israelis? You'll have arrived at what you want. I hope you can manage it. And Francis Remedios said, is the problem of the decline of civil society included in the problem of the decline of the welfare state? But at this point, I just am going to have to stop the formal session. But if you'd now like to continue by continuing what you were wanting to say or responding to those points, you can do so.
Jeremy, way to go. Thank you. And I'm here, of course.
Hooray for Jeremy.
Hooray for Jeremy, pal. Jeremy, כל הכבוד in Hebrew. And of course, nationalism or civil nationalism, and some say any kind of nationalism, but let's stick to civil nationalism. Of course, it is an invention. Anderson, I forget his full name, Benedict Anderson?
Yeah.
Suggested that since it is an invention or an imagined entity, it is non-existent. When I said this to Agassi one time, he said, oh, this is very interesting logic. Since the car is an invention, let me try to cross the street at a red light and see if nothing happens to me.
Okay, but I mean, that point was put by John Rock rather than myself.
Yeah, I know. I'm answering John Rock, thank you.
Okay, but I would like to raise a related point to you, which is what constitutes, I mean, who are the members of your civil nationalism? I mean, that's to say, Israel is characterized by the fact that, as I understand it, if someone is recognized appropriately as Jewish, they can claim Israeli citizenship. Historically, over time, the United States has had, at least officially, a strong notion of civic nationalism, but clearly it's to a considerable extent populated by immigrants. And so if you champion that against ethnic nationalism, you're faced with the problem, well, who and under what conditions can become a citizen of your civil nation?
Absolutely. And before answering that question, let me even try to focus the question more with your permission. Yeah. We have in Israel two large national minorities, the Arab population, the majority of which is Muslim, but not all of them are Muslim, of course. Yeah. By the way, it is interesting to note that in Israel, I don't know how many of you know this, the Druze in Israel, who are Arabs by any other criteria, claim that they are not Arabs. Because in Israel, to be an Arabic means to belong to Arabic nationalism. And the reason that I'm stuttering right now is that it is so hard for me to even say these ideas that I think are so absurd. But this is how it is in Israel. So you have the Arab national minority and you have the Jewish Orthodox national minority, and they are both to be considered national minorities because this is how they consider themselves, and this is how they are considered by the state of Israel. And which is most evident in the fact that members or the children, the sons and the daughters of both these groups are not recruited to the army, not 100% so, but largely so. And the question that Jeremy is raising is, what will be with them? Jeremy, did I get you correctly?
Well, not quite, because my question was more, who can become and under what conditions a member of your civic nation?
Yeah, in my words, can the Arab population in Israel, the vast majority of whom identify themselves, I'm sorry, I misspoke, and Nati said the correct version before, today they identify as Palestinian nationalists. Will we consider them Israeli nationals? Will they want to consider themselves Israeli nationals? And the same with the Jewish Orthodox. Will they be willing, and will we be willing, we, not including myself, because of course I will be willing, but will Israel be willing, and will they be willing to consider themselves as Israel nationals? As I said before, all these are open questions. I wish I had the beginning of answers to any of them. I can discuss them. I have ideas and things like that, but I do not know the answers by no means. And these are difficult questions because, yeah, sorry, okay.
Please indicate a hand if anyone else wants to come in.
Yeah, well, I do. My questions were in the very direction that was suggested by Jeremy and by earlier ones. Even civic nationalisms, and as I think Popper well pointed out, was based in a process of ethnic repression and cultural integration that I don't know we are all comfortable with. That's even civic nationalism. And unfortunately, that's the only place where civic nationalism flourishes. You pointed out yourself that in the United States, they started by excluding a large number of people on racial ground, on racial or on property grounds from their citizenship, right? At this point, you are wondering whether you can include other minorities and it's not only the question about the minorities. Again, some Jewish refugees will need to become Israeli citizens. Some Palestinian refugees, they have been excluded from the beginning, from 1948. So the very beginning of the establishment of what could be civic nationality was by excluding people. So how do you deal with that? And the problem is that nowhere, the problem is right now, civic national, we need to find ways of supporting civic nationalism culturally, if possible, also through ethnic compromises. Because the reason why civic nationalism fails is that much as this company shares the sympathy for universalistic ideals, if you push them too far, are also oppressive and repressive in themselves because they suppress the diversity and difference, right? But the problem is that, again, those ideals do not carry the days in any historical competition. I mean, this is why I'm deathly worried about the future. I did not think that in my own lifetime, I was going to see the possibility of the collapse of liberal democracy in Western countries. We almost saw it in the United States. We saw it in part of Europe. It never existed in Israel, okay? And it's in trouble even in Western Europe. I am deeply concerned. And so the very question is precisely, how do we support the type of civic nationalism that you would, or civil nationalism that you would like to promote? And we have no answer to it. Keeping and repeating it endless, will not help. We are in trouble.
Malachi, I don't have words to say how thankful I am for your input. There is, however, a small disagreement between us. You say that the exclusion that we saw take place in Israel in the first years after the Declaration of Independence was due to our attempt to instigate civil nationalism. I say the opposite. It was part of our rejection of civil nationalism.
Exactly. Yes. Yes.
Ah,
Yeah, no,
okay, then we are on the same page.
yes.
And your concern is my concern.
It represents you with a problem at this point, because I mean those people were excluded from your nationalism on ethnic grounds, and the only state that you can envision at this point establishing is one that excludes them.
Ah, excludes them at the present. We hope to end this state, or I hope to end this state of affairs. And I only add, and I think also on Agassi's behalf, that it's not just a nice ideal, it's a condition for seeing ourselves still existing in 10 years' time from now. We are on the verge of major catastrophes, I think worldwide. You noted yourself that we were on the verge of losing democracy in the United States, which is not a small matter. And I think you are absolutely right. I would just mention the fact that we have not heard anything from the Ku Klux Klan for, I think, about 40 years, so much so that many people indulged in the illusion that they were gone forever. I was one of these people. And then when Donald Trump started his campaign, or I think it was after he won the presidency, suddenly you heard them speak. And the Ku Klux Klan is alive and thriving in the United States today. So this is not a small matter, and it is very concerning indeed. I don't know what else I can say about that, except, yeah.
Can I interject a correction, please?
Better. Yeah, sure.
Just a correction. One is that the exclusion of the Palestinian diaspora was not only because of ethnic, but also because of civic nationality. You must say that because others were included in our society as nationals and not because of their ethnicity. We wanted to have a homogeneous state initially, and we forced citizenship on Arabs, not necessarily because of civil society or civil nationality, but because of nationalism and amalgamation of all these into our own society. We failed. The failure was corrected just recently by defining them as non-nationals. Now, the other point is the hazard of universalism, and by labeling the Orthodox Jews as a national minority, you just exemplified the hazards of extra universalism. You took universalism to the extreme. The religious Orthodox Jews are not a national minority. They are part of by law. They're part of the nation by law. They enjoy certain rights that you would prefer them not to enjoy, but they are not a national minority.
With your permission, I would leave that open because there are arguments in both directions. But I do wish to.
It's the law. It's the law.
But now I don't know exactly what comes after the word but there is a but there, and I want to leave it at that because there is a general question that is in the air all the time. And do you hear the noise in my house? I will just close the door. So
excuse me for interrupting, but as a response to Jeremy, who would be included in the nation today, every Orthodox Jew would be immediately included in the nation.
Possibly so. I wish to point out, Jeremy, we have a few minutes before the break is over?
Not a few. We have 3 minutes, and also I wanted to stick in a couple of brief points of my own. So if I could make these and then Nathaniel wants to come in,
No,
and
no,
then
no,
we
I'm-
hand over to you. Okay.
I've made my point.
Okay, just
If I may
very
just
quickly.
apologize, Jeremy, just let me just offer an apology right now. I really actually must. I have already overstayed what I am allowed to. I need to actually absolutely run and teach. It's really has been fascinating. I wish I could stay and continue that. I hope we can continue it. I must right now leave. Thank you all so much. It has been delightful.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much. Just very quickly, if I can stick in. First of all, this notion of civic nationalism has been stressed relatively recently. I mean, I'm talking here about I think the 1980s by Michael Walzer very strongly in his political theory. But this then leads me to pose a question, because I heard him talking about this when I was a legal resident of the US, but not a citizen. I had a green card, and I attempted to make a comment to him about something else by starting to say, well, look, I can participate in basically a civil forum in the United States as a green card holder, not as a citizen. Do you want to exclude me? I don't want to become an American citizen. I'm very happy just to hold a green card. And so what do you do with that kind of case? Another twist is just that one of the contributions about the exclusion of women and the exclusion of the very poor was a concern about dependence. And this, I mean, that's to say, you might put this more respectably in terms of saying, does civic nationalism require that in a way people can make up their own minds on things rather than perhaps just simply voting as they're told to by the leader of some particular group? And a problem could be that you may need certain kinds of conditions for things to work, which you wouldn't necessarily get just by formally incorporating everybody. However, our time is really on this exhausted in the sense that we have to get to something else. There are comments also coming on the on the comment stuff as well, and I fear that I mean, it was bound to be the case that if you brought up an issue which is both so interesting, but also which relates to problems in Israel, that this would generate rather more discussion than we could manage in the allotted time. But I have now to call a halt on this and move over to the next session.
Thank you.
So can I apologize for making that move? And Nimrod, you'll be ready for me to recognize you in a second.
Yehezkeli, you were all so quiet.
Okay, just a sec. We have Nimrod. Nimrod Bar-Am is a philosopher of logic and metaphysics. He was Agassi's research student from 1993 to 1997 and is currently a senior lecturer in the communications department of Sapir College, Israel. His latest book, In Search of a Simple Introduction to Communication, was published by Springer in 2016. He's going to talk to us about metaphysical perspectives and their role in science. Nimrod.
Thank you, Jeremy. Since my presentation is to be short and the matter before us subtle, and since this talk is but a summary of a more detailed paper.
Your microphone. Put your microphone in a better place.
You can't hear me?
Oh, no, it's not clear, Nimrod.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I can try and speak without the handphones. Is this better?
Yes, much better.
Since my presentation is to be short and the matter before us subtle, and since this talk is but a summary of a more detailed paper, which you may easily obtain by sending me an email, I will settle today for making 7 brief comments on the matter of Popper and Agassi on metaphysical perspectives and their role in science. My first comment is somewhat obvious. Critical rationalism was the first serious non-justificationist philosophy of science. It was therefore natural to expect that it would generate a revolution in the traditional relationship between metaphysical systems and science. For the traditional role of metaphysical systems was of course to justify science. Once this self-defeating task, finding an Uber turtle that will stand on its own back while functioning somehow as a fulcrum for lifting science to a secure ground, once this task was flatly relinquished, the road was open for a new type of cooperation. The empirical and the metaphysical then could and should have been regarded instantly as parts of a continuum of criticizable and improvable attempts to make sense of our environment. This did not occur. Comment number 2. Popper was remarkably quick to grasp the non-justificationist revolution that he was advancing. But only slowly and gradually did he realize that it implied that metaphysics provides subtler services to science. Instead, his early writings deny that it does any positive service, and he denied that there is anything like progress in metaphysics. Instead, he centered his efforts on purifying empirical science from metaphysical speculations, aka the demarcation criterion. Consider, for example, the following quote, which I will read to you. Please note not only its content, which may be familiar to you, but also its astonishingly positivistic vocabulary and style, which to this day still amazes me. And I'm quoting: "Any form of empiricism must, above all, demand from the theory of knowledge that it secures empirical science against the claims of metaphysics. The theory of knowledge must establish a strict and universally applicable criterion that allows us to distinguish between the statements of the empirical sciences and metaphysical assertions, the criterion of demarcation." And he sums up, "In case of doubt," I repeat, in case of doubt, how can we decide whether one is dealing with scientific statements or merely with a metaphysical assertion? Or more simply, when is science not science? That's Popper 1934, page 72. By declaring metaphysical assertions unscientific then, and by placing them in the wastebasket pseudoscience, the early Popper blurred the distinction between metaphysical systems that are valuable to science and which Agassi later on would have no problem tagging scientific, and worthless metaphysical systems which hinder scientific progress. And he rendered quite a lot of the refutable petitions scientific. For example, the easily refutable sentence, "My blessing will make you immune to all illness." The demarcation criterion then, as Agassi observed, is A, too narrow, excluding, say, Dalton's atomism from the realm of science. B, too wide, admitting unintelligent but refutable superstitions into science. And it is also C, it assumes an unbecoming and anti-liberal role of a bouncer for an imaginary exclusive science club. Comment number 3. Now, from the 50s onward, Popper clearly, gradually retracted from his early all-or-nothing positivistic approach to metaphysical systems. He gradually recognized the importance of some metaphysical frameworks to science, most notably indeterminism and realism. Consequently, he gradually explored manners by which some metaphysical frameworks can be embraced, while others dismissed. Metaphysical systems, he stressed, can be rationalized, criticized, and even improved upon. Comment number 4. However, and this is my main point today, Popper never explicitly and openly admitted the obvious implications of his earlier errors. He therefore remained curiously and self-defeatingly steadfast with respect to the idea that his demarcation criterion allows one to dismiss metaphysical frameworks as untestable, unempirical, and therefore unscientific. And I quote, "My business, as I see it," he says in 1959, "is to define the concepts of empirical science and metaphysics in such a way that we shall be able to say of a given system of statements whether or not its closest study is the concern of empirical science." In the longer version of this talk, I trace this attitude to Popper's ambivalence towards two very distinct versions of his demarcation criterion. There is the misleading and, in my mind, positivistic version that pretends to be a semantical bouncer of theories per se, and there is the brilliant psychosocial recommendation to encourage openness to criticism whenever this is possible. The mark of science is not testability, but openness to criticism, and the two terms are far from being coextensive. Let me repeat that. The mark of science is not testability, but openness to criticism, and the two terms are far from being coextensive. Thus, in Popper's regrettably most famous paper, Conjectures and Refutations, Popper famously still dismisses Marxism, the psychologies of Freud and Adler, and astrology as cases of pseudoscience, as cases of pseudoscientific theories. This is Popper 1963, page 37. Rather than simply denouncing the dogmatism characteristic of some of their adherents. He therefore appears to be claiming that there is something inherently defective with these theories as theories, and without even providing rough formulations of them. They appear to be informative, he argues, while in fact being irrefutable in principle. This, Agassi has shown, is both false and misleading. Astrology is clearly both refutable and false. It is also unintelligent, but this is a different matter. Many of Marx's famous predictions were also refuted, and Popper was, of course, a world authority on such refutations. Freud also noted some of his failures and corrected his theory in their light. All this, to repeat, boils down to a conflation of two distinct senses of Popper's demarcation criterion. His brilliant portrayal of science as an anti-dogmatic communal effort on the one hand, and his slightly overambitious and, in my view, failed attempt to present it as a quasi-semantic bouncer for certain theories on the other hand. The end result of all this, and here again I am speaking in highly condensed code due to my pressing time frame, is that in the place where Popper comes closest to expressing the Agassian view of metaphysics, which I will soon formulate, the truly brilliant Appendix X of the English edition of LSD, Popper inexplicably avoids the gargantuan elephant in the room by systematically refraining from referring to it. Please make no mistake, what Popper calls in this outstanding appendix points of view are unambiguously metaphysical points of view. And what Popper brilliantly argues about them there, you may recall, is that without them, the very notion of repeatability, the foundation of empirical science, disintegrates. Simply put, science is impossible without a metaphysical cradle. At the time Popper wrote this appendix, Agassi was his research assistant. He reported to me pressing Popper about the curious avoidance from referring to the metaphysical elephant by its proper name. Popper, he reports, systematically blocked all attempts to discuss his curious avoidance. Then Agassi asked Popper to be excused from further discussing the details of this appendix with him. Popper, he further reports, characteristically ignored his request. Comment number 6. What Agassi brings to the subtle matter of metaphysical perspectives and their role in science then is first and foremost non-defensive directness. With him, metaphysics becomes an acknowledged, integral, unavoidable, and openly welcomed part of every attempt to make sense of reality. It is presupposed a la Collingwood by every question that we can possibly formulate, although contrary to Collingwood, it of course does not imply anything like a clear and distinct hierarchy of presuppositions reaching all the way to absolute presuppositions, which according to Collingwood are not criticizable. Agassi dismisses all this as relativistic nonsense. The demarcation criterion then, in its positivistic version, becomes uninteresting simply because we no longer take interest in securing empirical science against anything, let alone against metaphysical frameworks, without which it would be virtually meaningless. Agassi, therefore, takes it as a matter of course that some perfectly empirical theories are nevertheless expressions of bad scientific thinking, astrology again, whereas some metaphysical systems, for example, mechanism, are markedly scientific without being testable. Good science is critical then, but not necessarily empirical. Last comment. The most basic service of metaphysical perspectives, argues Agassi, is nourishing our sense of proportion. For example, metaphysical perspectives direct our attention towards some unrefuted universal statements, suggesting them as interesting candidates for natural laws, whereas they lead us to ignore other such candidates as uninteresting or even silly. That's Agassi, 1975. And I quote, "What looks a natural necessity one generation may look an accidental necessity at the next. I explain this by reference to our changing metaphysical framework." End of quote. Popper could have easily adopted this view. Alas, he refused to openly grant metaphysical systems such an active and central role in determining our scientific agenda, and so found himself adhering to the bluntly Aristotelian speculation that laws of nature are logically stronger somehow than merely accidental universal statements. That's Popper, 1959 again. To conclude, Popper clearly and rightly continually tempered his early positivistic views regarding metaphysical frameworks. However, despite the amazing progress that he had made, his polemical context enticed him not to let go of the positivistic version of his demarcation criterion. His attitude towards metaphysics, therefore, remained ambivalent. With Agassi, we receive a view of metaphysics that openly admits metaphysical considerations as embracing and directing our quests, our research goals, as well as direct our evaluation standards. Metaphysical considerations take part in every observation sentence that we can make then, as well as outline the manners by which we deem them significant. Popper's demarcation criterion, he therefore argues, not only fails its intended task, but more importantly, loses its appeal as a worthy philosophical agenda. Now, if I have one more minute.
Yes, certainly.
I'm happy to give an example. Popper's picture of the atomism, and I'm speaking here of Popper 1994, so this is the latest that we can have, is that it was a metaphysical framework until 1905, when it became testable and so scientific. This is too binary and stiff, I argue. Since Popper was extremely knowledgeable in the history of science, this stiffness should perhaps be attributed again to polemical considerations or to his lack of sincere interest in the role of metaphysical perspectives in science. But the fact of the matter seems to me that Agassi is right to point out that such a view does little justice to the history of science. Dalton's atomism, to take just one example, includes the clearly empirical novel notion of an exact weight of atomic compounds. It is a huge improvement upon the original Democritian system, which incidentally also includes empirical conjectures.
800 service.
Bill.
From 800 service.
Wait, I'll mute Bill. So it is a huge improvement upon the original Democritian system, which incidentally also includes empirical conjectures, such as the claim that round molecules are sweet and sharp-edged ones are hot. Admittedly, it was untestable at Democritus' time, but certainly it's testable today. Such improvements by Dalton can only be attributed to his scientific new problem situation, that is, his search for an explanation of the law of multiple proportions. Scientific metaphysical theories are therefore in constant progress in virtue of their dialogue with increasingly improving empirical ones. And this I take to be Agassi's central argument.
Thanks very much. Sorry, did I cut into you? Do you want to say more? Have we got hands for this? Yehezkeli.
I want to say that it was Karl Popper who presented in his courses the idea that his demarcation is of explanations, of scientific explanations, whereas in Logik der Forschung it is of theories. So his lectures were one step still away from Wittgenstein. So I think it is a better version of it, which is quite remarkable. And one has to say that here Popper invented a very important theory that is now accepted, taken for granted, but hardly mentioned as is, namely the theory of content and content increase. As, for example, the difference between versions of atomism, which was mentioned. These are important contributions that are taken for granted without noticing their importance, both for Popper's philosophy of science and as a general idea. The main question is, what does Popper mean by accept? Now, most people use the word accept the way the empiricists use it, namely believe in. And that is certainly not true, because Popper explicitly said that the theory of belief belongs to psychology and not to philosophy of science, because otherwise it would be circular. So by accept, he means intend to test, namely to refute. And this looks a bit perverse, so nobody mentions it, but I think this is both the power and the innovation of Popper, the boldness of his theory. That is, of course, all in much agreement with what we have just heard. I need to stress.
Okay. Nathaniel?
Yes, Nimrod, thank you so much. This was so clear and really summarizing all in one. And I was reminded of the response of Popper to Agassi in his Shilp volume, where Agassi presents modified conventionalism. And I think it is a tough position to hold all the way. And Popper was reacting to this. And to this moment, I was unclear about the reason why he reacted to it so much. But here I think you offer a sort of an explanation. He could not tolerate losing grounds. And Yoske, would you agree with that?
Yeah.
Because he offered instead modified essentialism. And as a modified essentialist, he couldn't go all the way with modified conventionalism that would have really freed him up altogether to accept metaphysics as part of science.
Yeah, but his response to me was that he never offered the idea of modified essentialism, that this was a reviewer in TLS that ascribed this idea to him and invented this name. So he didn't want to be either modified essentialist or modified conventionalist.
Yes, this is an afterthought. You told so much about his meticulous attention to the papers and to his corrections. I wouldn't believe that he would let a paper go without his editorial note. But it's a story.
I've stuck my hand up next because I want to signal a very strong dissent from Nimrod's account. I just think you got it horribly all wrong. Clearly, all I can do here is to give a brief indication why we'd have really to look at this in more detail. But I'd have thought the situation is very different from what you've said. I think it's pretty plausible to take Popper as thinking all along that he had metaphysical views, but that his problem essentially in his early writing was that he didn't have an account of how one could critically appraise metaphysical theories. As a result, he tried in Die beiden Grundprobleme and then in Logic of Scientific Discovery to make his account of science stand independently of metaphysics. To the degree to which he does that, I mean, it's not clear if he was successful. It was clear, though, that he does state explicitly that in Logic of Scientific Discovery, you know, in the, that's to say, the Logik der Forschung material, that certain metaphysical ideas played a positive role in the development of science. For example, atomism. You have then got, as the second point, his development, according to him in his lectures from the late 1940s, but certainly then set out in the postscript, his ideas about metaphysical research programs, and indeed his championing of his own ideas about propensities as an example of such a program. And then a crucial thing seems to me to be his paper published in that's available in Conjectures, which comes from 1958, in which he discusses how he thinks one can critically appraise metaphysical theories. And it's then interesting to note that on page 40 of chapter 2 of Objective Knowledge, he actually makes a comment along the following lines. He says, I describe that in my Logik der Forschung, I describe myself as a metaphysical realist. In those days, I identified wrongly the limits of science with those of arguability. I later changed my mind and argued that non-testable, i.e. irrefutable metaphysical theories may be rationally arguable. And he gives a reference to the conjectures paper.
But then he doesn't draw the conclusions.
Well, he doesn't draw the conclusions that
with respect to the demarcation criterion, which makes him. I mean, when a person is ambivalent, it's hard to disagree with him, because in some sense you are in a disagreement, and in another sense you are not in a disagreement. So of course, if you quote the Popper A, then he is not in disagreement with Agassi, and if you quote Popper B, then he is. Yehezkeli, would you like to add anything?
I would like to observe one thing. We all mentioned the example of atomism, which is very important and very interesting, and is prominent in the Logik der Forschung as it comes at the very end. I would add to it that Popper says we should not imitate it, we should not take it as the paradigm of scientific research. He says so explicitly that he doesn't want to take this as more than historically odd event. I should also mention that in the Logik der Forschung, he says he's a realist, but he says that his realism is private, because the whole book is machien in the sense that he tries to avoid any debate, for instance, about truth. He himself said that he was worried about truth because it was before Tarski, but what it says is differently. It says we have disagreements about truth, and therefore I will not discuss truth, but we don't have disagreement about falsehood, especially about contradiction, and contradiction is enough for me, which is brilliant, by the way, one of the most exciting passages in Logik der Forschung that Popper ignored completely afterwards because it doesn't square with Tarski.
Just one brief comment on this, if I may.
Yes.
There are two different things. One is what the history of Popper's views was. The second is, should one interpret the resulting position as you do? And what I was trying modestly to suggest.
You're marvelous, there's no question.
What I was trying modestly to suggest was that your account was one that I don't think really does justice to what he says about these things, but it's also clear that what you wanted him to say at the end was something that he doesn't say. And I just want to say, I think one should separate these things, but at the same time, I don't want to try to argue you out of this now, because it would be a complete impossibility. I mean, compared to that, the discussion about Israel would be...
No, we have no quarrel, but I would request of you, when you go home, look for a passage anywhere in Popper in which he says, what does the word accept signify? Because certainly it doesn't mean believe in. So what does it, I don't think he says anywhere, what does it mean?
Thanks very much. I have Raphael now.
Again, thank you, Nimrod. I concur with Nati. It was crystal clear and helpful. But I'd like you to give me, it's not a but, and I'd like you to give me an elaboration, or give us an elaboration on the shift that you see, and I think it's a metaphysical, not just a practical shift, on the question, on the demarcation question between Popper and Agassi. Because if I understood you correctly, that pivots a lot of views and issues that come up in both. And if I understood you, and that's why I'd like you either correct me or elaborate, that Popper was a dogmatist about it for a long time, and Agassi was a much more liberal about that, and really transformed that whole question into a new level of analysis. Is this your position, or would you?
Yes, I think Popper thought that the demarcation criterion gives him leverage. And so he refused to let go of it. And I think Agassi cares little about it. He cares about criticism and not about the the tag science.
I have Bill now, and then we're going to have to call a halt to go on to the next session. Bill.
Yes, just briefly on Popper on acceptance. He is very ambiguous about what acceptance means, but the one thing that he's clear about is he say we accept.
Yes.
So we implies unanimity within the scientific community about what is accepted and what is rejected. And I think that unanimity is contradicted.
You also mentioned that it was a fiction, that it is a fiction.
Hmm?
You also mentioned earlier that it is a fiction. Unanimity.
Yeah, exactly. It's that unanimity is a fiction. Yeah.
Okay. Can I move us now to the next session? And John, are you ready for me to introduce you?
Yes.
Thanks very much. Well, our next speaker is John Wettersten. He wrote his doctorate under Agassi's guidance at BU. He taught philosophy at the University of South Carolina and at Siegen University in Germany. He's now an emeritus adjunct professor of philosophy of science at Universität Mannheim. Among his over 100 publications are 4 books, and 2 collections of his essays will appear shortly. And he is due to speak to us on the topic, how Agassi changed the core problems of critical rationalism. John.
Okay. One step forward from Agassi's inquiries on logic, a fallibilist logic for critical rationalism. One central theme of the many aspects of the development of critical rationalism is the improvement of the description of the procedures and institutions of science. This theme is by far the most dominant one, and it touches many problems. A further aspect has seen far less interest, but is also of considerable importance. Or perhaps the interest has been at hand, but no one has had any innovative way of moving forward. This neglected theme is the determination of formal aspects of critical rationalism. It was exceedingly important for Popper, as is clear from his formal studies in logic. After Popper, Agassi has been the only one who has taken up the theme. He has led the way in posing the problem of what formal problems there are after Popper's attempt to devise his own logic broke down. Popper's series of essays on logic without foundations sought to provide the appropriate logical framework for critical rationalism. Popper's attempts to deal with formal problems ran quite quickly up against a seemingly paradoxical situation. On the one hand, they have all been attempts to meet the universal standards of logic, and this means that the results have to be proven. No possible counterexample should be possible. On the other hand, critical rationalism has provided no such proof, even for logic, and Popper did not want to develop a fallibilist logic. A universal logic should be the foundationalist pillar of a fallibilist methodology. Popper tried to achieve his aim with his logic without foundations. He had a universal logic without any proof. It was a simple beginning of inference without a theory of logical inference, that is, proof. Popper's program for logic was above all an attempt to move past the results of Alfred Tarski. From Tarski's perspective, the rules of logic are rules describing the relationships between sentences in some clearly specified object language. They are then not universal, but merely statements about the rules between sentences in some object language. This is a limitation Popper wanted to remove. In his later discussion of verisimilitude, Popper related and admitted Tarski's limitation of logic could not be eliminated in any formal way. We could, however, take German as our object language and English as our meta language, or the other way around. And from a technical point of view, we cannot take the 2 kinds of rules to be interchangeable without further ado. But, Popper said, we could do it anyway. The difference plays no role in our use of logic. That is, The problem which he worked years to solve did not need to be solved at all. One way to tackle problems today is to return to the problems Popper posed after his encounter with Tarski. On this view, we need to return to Popper's logic and determine what can be saved from it. We need some way to overcome the limitation in Tarski's logic. We need to discuss the difference between a logic and a logic of. We need a theory of logic of which meets traditional standards of universality, which Tarski's is not. This opens a Pandora's box. Thus, we need a more innovative approach. As far as I know, Agassi has been the only one to move in this direction. If I understand him correctly, his aim is quite serious. He wants to coherently integrate the Popperian view of logic with the traditional view of logic and with fallibilism. So far as I know, he has not solved the problems he has posed, but the problems are important because they identify a gap or gaps in critical rationalism. Popper was quite right in his observation that fallibilist methodology needs to be integrated with logic if it is to offer a coherent alternative to traditional views. In order to do this, there are at least two options open. One option is to provide a new logic which proves logical propositions without any background knowledge. The creation of foundationalist logic could offer proof in logic which would not contradict the claim that there is no proof of statements about the world. Popper tried very hard to provide such a logic, but he did not succeed. So another alternative was required. To do that, one needs a new perspective on Popper's logic, which would offer some explanation of what went wrong and how it could be corrected. At times, Agassi moves in this direction. In doing so, he offers a new fallibilist view of logic. But I have not found the new path promising. I do not think that Popper's program of finding a universal logic without foundations can be successfully resuscitated. Another approach is to build fallibilism into logic. Agassi cautiously moves in this direction, but he has not explicitly suggested that this is the way we should proceed. He goes in this direction for two reasons. First, he points out that Popper dramatically and correctly puts the retransmission of the falsity of the conclusion of a valid argument to at least one of the premises of that argument at the center of logic. Agassi's portrayal does not say clearly just what the revised field then looks like, but his observation that Popper's initiative of putting this kind of inference at the center of logic is a good way to at least partially set the stage for a discussion of the logic of critical rationalism. I will return to this problem below. Oh, man. The second reason Agassi provides for moving logic in the direction of fallibilism is the fact that Tarski's logic is central to any logic of critical rationalism, and that Tarski's logic, or logics, is a logic of. Can we proceed by working within Tarski's framework, or do we need to revise Tarski's approach when we apply it to the context of critical rationalism? On the basis of Agassi's analysis, I try here to take a few steps forward. I suggest that we try to set Tarski's logic in a fallibilist context. In order to do that, we need to replace Tarski's own assumptions about what the application of logic should achieve and replace them with a fallibilist view of what logic needs to achieve in order to be productive. Tarski's logic led him to effectively reduce all logic to mathematical logic. The apparent reason for this near reduction was that he set very high standards for his results. They should be so clear and specific that any result is nearly certain. Since any proof in logic requires the clear and specific specification of an object language, the only way of doing this in a Tarskian logic, which meets Tarski's high standards, is to make the object language mathematics. Mathematics offers methods to meet high standards of clarity and specificity as no alternative does. Not even in science has such clarity and specificity ever been attained, because theories are regularly revised, improved, or replaced, as Tarski pointed out. So logic, when done properly, is mathematical logic. But there is here a paradox for critical rationalists. No critical rationalist defends Tarski's high demands. Tarski wants true results, which sounds much like the results sought by justificationist philosophers of science. Popper is, of course, himself no justificationist, but at times he remains close to them, perhaps as close as he thinks he can. In spite of this, Popper implicitly accepts Tarski's justificationist standards as standards which any theory of proof in logic or science should meet. He nowhere notes that he and Tarski on this point are by no means in agreement. He clearly wanted to find agreement with Tarski. One can presume that he wanted to do this because Tarski's logic, and above all his theories of truth and of inference, had been so important for his own explicit development of his realist perspective on science. Perhaps he feared that if he disagreed with Tarski on the aims of logic and science, he would no longer have the partial agreement he had apparently achieved. And this partial agreement, at least from Popper's point of view, was crucial for the presentation of his own methodology as the successful implementation of logic. Agassi brings movement into the discussion by discussing the value and nature of the use of Tarskian logics of. His result is by no means the same as that practiced by Tarski. He does not effectively limit the object language in various logics of to mathematics, but he also does not provide any clear proposals for developing new alternatives. Indeed, he almost moves in the opposite direction. He points out that moving in the direction of logics of is not comparable with the discovery of the possibility of constructing non-Euclidean logics. When non-Euclidean logics were constructed, mathematicians did not merely reject Euclid's parallel axiom. They put alternatives in its place, and these alternatives gave the non-Euclidean geometries their own alternative constructions of space. But when one moves from logic to logics of, there is no analogous possibility at hand. One specifies various logics based on the various object language which are used in their development, but one does not create alternative systems analogous to the way non-Euclidean geometries do. Agassi points out that when one rejects some assumptions of logic in new alternatives, say in the assumption that P or not P is true, the result is merely a special case of what was at hand before. And he quotes Gödel to the effect that his demonstration that there exist two statements which cannot be proven should not be deemed an unhappy limitation of logic. New knowledge shows that there can be many new alternatives. The shift to viewing all logic as Tarskian logic proposed here is viewed by nearly all logicians as an unacceptable development. This is so because it abandons the search for universality of logic. This objection is clear in an essay by John Etchemendy, in which he points out that Tarski's logic of inference cannot be the university of logic of inference as it is thought to be by virtually all logicians. The reason for this impossibility lies in the fact that it cannot be universally applied. It is relatively easy to find sentences with apparently synonymous words which cannot be exchanged for one another in sentences in logical inferences without rendering valid inferences invalid. The reason for this is that there is not now any single semantics for all sentences. Semantics are limited to specific object language, and this prevents one from meeting Etchemendy's established standards from logic. From an intellectual point of view, I do not take this objection to Tarski's logic of inference to be serious. It is not serious because no such semantical theory such as that deemed by Etchemendy as a necessary foundation for logic is possible. But nevertheless, because it seems to many to be necessary for proof and proof to be necessary for logic, it is widely presumed that Etchemendy's position is correct. In fact, it is merely a dogmatic assertion of the certainty of Carnap's program. But from my point of view, this is exactly that which we want to dispense with. What does the intellectual world in which all logic is Tarskian logic look like? First, we need to recognize that it must be contrary to Tarski's own position fallibilist. Tarski maintained that all logic is a logic of. We need to use meta-language to specify object languages in each case. In order to avoid mistakes, object language need to be clearly and specifically identified. This is a difficult task. Apparently, Tarski saw no alternative to creating only mathematical object languages. So far as I know, he never says that that is the case. One seems to need methods found in mathematics to meet the high standards one needs to meet the high standards properly set for logic. We need to meet these standards to avoid mistakes which arise when the relationships between sentences lose clarity. This reduction of logic to mathematical logic is a direct consequence of the high demands Tarski places on the pursuit of truth. We must either find true statements or be very near to finding true statements in order to obtain acceptable consequences. If, however, we reject this far too high demand and take a Popperian turn, we may remove the demand to construct logics of in ways which prevent errors from occurring. Instead of striving to build logics of which are nearly immune from errors, we may seek to find errors in inferences. Just as we learn from our good mistakes in science, we may learn from our good mistakes in logic of. After we have used a meta-language to specify an object language, we may proceed in a Tarskian way by describing the relationships between sentences in the object language, which is AN, just as Tarski did in his theory of truth and his theory of logic inference. But we do not merely seek certainty, we also seek to find mistakes. Where do we find invalid inferences? The discoveries of such invalid inferences are a clear indication that mistakes have been made in the specifications of object language. Words which are specified as synonyms are found not to be synonyms. The discovery of such errors is a basis for the steady improvement of our logics of, and this means our understanding of the world is improved because our descriptions of reality made in our object languages are thereby improved. In general, we may note that Agassi's significant observation that Popper made an important advance in logic by pointing out that logic is above all the retransmission of falsity, describes the central approach of all logic. By making Tarskian logic fallible, we rendered Popper's observation that the central assumption of all logic is the retransmission of falsity, that it is a universal view of logic. In conclusion, I make 2 points concerning a fallibilist logic. First, such a logic renders it easier to construct a theory of verisimilitude, which treats both the appraisal of verisimilitude and verisimilitude as imperfect but open to criticism and improvable. It relaxed the exceedingly high standards which Popper sought to meet in his 2 attempts, neither of which provide a means of appraising the verisimilitude of theories. A fallibilist theory of verisimilitude can do that to some degree. Second, a fallibilist logic can be interpreted as a way of coping with problems in specific intellectual cum linguistic problems. They create strategies of dealing with problems just as methodological rules do. The difficulty posed by Agassi, according to which logic is either Platonic or conventional, does not arise. We can view the results of logic as rules of solving problems in specific linguistic context. An institutional fallibilism, as I have elsewhere explained, can be applied here. In order to deal with this situation, Agassi applies his mistaken version of methodological individualism. He views each occurrence of a logic of an attempt by an individual to solve a problem. With a fallibilist logic and a better theory of individual action, this approach can be dispensed with. That's it.
Thanks very much, John. Do we have any comments or questions? Anyone?
I only want to say that I endorse the criticism that John levels against me is quite right. My work is just preliminary. I think Nimrod went further and developed more fallibilist logic further on, but that's not for me now to expose.
Well, you say it's preliminary, but in fact, it goes farther than anybody else.
Nimrod, have you any comments?
No, I was impressed with the talk. There is an idea which I often wonder, you know, the Agassi students sometimes have this problem that Agassi ascribes to Popper ideas, which are sometimes difficult to find in Popper. And in the matter of logic, he sometimes ascribed to Popper the idea that logic is an agreement between a teacher and a student about the rules for searching the truth. And this idea is brilliant, and I wonder if it's Agassi's or Popper. It's not easy to decide. Maybe Agassi or John can comment upon
it. It's back to the pre-Socratics.
You read it there.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I made no attempt to check if Agassi's attributions to Popper, whatever they may be, are really true. I presume so.
Anyone else? Well, could I thank you very much, John? I'm sure this isn't a matter of any problem with the paper, so much as you're having taken up a topic on which really most of us just aren't qualified to make a comment. But thank you so much for doing this and for giving our last paper on the topic. Can I turn now to Yehezkeli? We've got, as the end of our discussion, any space for you to make comments or reflections. Do you have anything you'd like to add?
Yes, I want to say, first of all, how fortunate I am. When I think of it, that with all the honors that Karl Popper had, he never had such a session as I had now, which he certainly deserved more than I. This is really very moving, and I hope I deserve the attention that you all paid me, which is really an overwhelming compliment. Again, I wish I was sure I deserve it. I really consider myself, as a few of you said, more of a student and as a teacher, as a student. That is to say, what I learned from my yeshiva days mostly is the lack of caste difference between teacher and student that you find in the university. Of course, the yeshiva is greatly defective in that it has only males and that traditionally it has only one subject, not in the Middle Ages, but today it has only one subject. But otherwise, the most remarkable thing about the Talmudic attitude to controversy is the lack of ego. When you play chess and you win or lose, you don't consider it much of a personal characteristic. You may be a good player, a not so good player. If you play with a great expert, then you expect to lose, or the same would be if you take tennis. But somehow in debates, it's different. I remember when I argued with my professors in the university when I was a student, the professor said, first of all, you are mistaken, and they showed me my mistake. And secondly, now that you see how stupid you are, please shut up. And this looked to me very strange. Yes, I was stupid. Yes, I learned. This should make me repeat myself and learn more, not shut up. But the traditional method of teaching, which Popper discusses at great length, is what he calls the bucket theory. And I think this is really a remarkable paper of Popper, in which he says nothing new, and it is nevertheless an exciting paper. Namely, that tradition has one direction of learning, and that the Enlightenment ignored tradition and teaching altogether. Indeed, Bacon blamed teachers for everything, and really said the best student is one who never goes to school. That is, by the way, the noble savage idea. Voltaire tells a story about a primitive fellow who came to Paris and was put in jail, and since his mind was empty, he learned all the modern arts and sciences within a few weeks in jail. That's it, in a novel of Voltaire. This is a remarkable idea that the noble savage, A, has no prejudices, B, therefore he can learn fast. Popper's paper towards a rational theory of traditions is one of his greatest contributions, and he says something very simple. We don't have to reject tradition, in fact we cannot, and we don't have to accept tradition. We should be critical about it, but the criticism has to be piecemeal. That's where really the idea of piecemeal appears, both intellectually and later also politically in his Open Society, that the criticism has to be piecemeal. That is to say, take the West that we have and try to improve it. This gives Popper's theory its unity, and he himself, towards the end of his life, said that the peak of his ideas was the unification of scientific method and of democracy. He said that, and I think that is true, and that is, of course, we should all say an idealization and something to be discussed critically and so on, but it is his final vision, and I think we all have to admire it as something great. It's not the only thing we didn't mention here, for example, his theory of probability, which is an enormous achievement and which was acknowledged only very reluctantly and only after a famous mathematician or two sided with him and opened the road to accepting it. There's no question that there was an enormous bias against Popper. There was a conspiracy of silence against him, as against Faraday, as we mentioned before, and that this certainly loomed large in Popper's life. He was a difficult man, as Bartley noted, and his being difficult man was rooted in his complaint, which I would say is not philosophical, but valid. I tried to learn from Popper. I tried to learn from Popper both how to behave. He taught me how to behave. I behaved like a rowdy Israeli when I came to him. And he taught me, I hope I learned from him to write. He taught me to write with extremely great patience, going over really poor manuscripts of mine and correcting them very patiently again and again and again. There's no question about it. By the way, he never read my doctorate. He read only 2 or 3 pages of it. But again, he corrected them, and this was for me extremely valuable. I'm speaking now of Popper because I'm being honored, and I want to say how much I owe to Popper. I really should say I was a failure in all respects until I met him. And when I met him, the most remarkable thing about him was that he never asked me for any documents, for any explanation of my worth. Why should he pay attention to me? He asked me why should he listen to me? And I said, I have some idea that I want to develop. And he asked me what it is. And I said to him, people think we develop from theory to theory, but I think we develop from question to better question. And this idea, however odd it is and open to criticism and so on, this made him ready to accept me. And he said, don't move from University College to LSE because this will disqualify you for a doctorate, but you can come and visit me anytime. And I said, I don't care about the doctorate. I'm going to switch from University College to London School of Economics. Fortunately for me, the professor in University College lied and considered my registration there a technical error. And so I was able to receive a doctorate in LSE. I have 2 letters from the academic registrar of the University of London. One says that I should stop pestering him. I will never receive any degree in his university. And in the other letter, he tells me that he is very happy to inform me in retrospect and so on. I can't tell you how lucky I was that I met Popper. I think with this I should stop.
Thank you so much, Yehezkeli.
Thank you all. You're doing me great honor.
I would like to make 1 or 2 concluding remarks. The first of these is to thank Nimrod. I approached Nimrod with the idea that we might hold such a thing, but if I can be a little bit indelicate, my role in this was throwing up a particular seed of an idea in roughly the way in which an irresponsible young man might throw a seed of something else in the direction of a young woman and then disappear for a long, long time, only to come back to find that it has developed into something utterly splendid. And this was Nimrod's work. Thank you so much, Nimrod, for putting this together and putting all the work in. It's really a hell of an achievement.
Yeah.
The second thing is to thank the participants. As Yehezkeli said earlier at the end of our first sessions, really, this has been a pleasure and stimulating, and I think we got much more out of this than we could reasonably have expected. Thank you all. The third note of thanks is to Yehezkeli. I mean, first of all, for furnishing with us so much stimulating writing and work and commentary. And as we've had a testimony for so many of the people who worked with him, for the personal example of him as a teacher and nurturer of so many of those who've joined us today. But he didn't just do that. He also came along and discussed these issues with us, offered us comments, criticism, suggestions, tasks that we should go off and do. It has just been staggering. In getting ready for our gathering today, I was suddenly thinking, well, actually, we've had a really good symposium, but it's only just sort of scraped the surface of what might be possible. Consider the work that Yehezkeli did with Ian Jarvie on the rationality of magic. Consider also their book on aesthetics. And my suspicion is that each of you could think a bit about things that Yehezkeli has contributed either on his own or in collaboration, which really demand papers and discussions which we just haven't mentioned at all. What's to be done about this? Well, I took the opportunity to repeat what I did initially. I wrote to Nimrod and also to Yehezkeli saying, what about another one? And they, I'm delighted to say, have agreed. And so, if I can put it so, next year also at Sapir, we're going to have another one of these roughly this time next year. And if you're interested in contributing a paper, do be in touch with us about that possibility. And if you have any other ideas or suggestions, that would be very much welcome. I also conclude with a tiny plug, which is that there is, in the meantime, a third Popper-related conference, which is going to take place on Zoom in March. And if anyone has an interest in contributing to that, just send me a note about it. That isn't something for which Nimrod has responsibility. And in some ways, I think that Nimrod should be perfectly happy with that, because he can really rest on his laurels for what he's done with this. Thank you once again so much, Nimrod, Yehezkeli, and all the participants.
Thank you, and way to go.
Do you wish to say anything, Nimrod, or?
I'm very grateful that I'm able to be grateful. It's not always possible to be grateful to a person while he's alive, and so it's a real fortune. I feel fortunate.
There are thank yous coming also from the larger group.
That's great.
I may say something.
Thank you.
Although
Yes,
I'm
sure.
not an organizer, I really would like to thank the two organizers and tell Yehezkeli how grateful we are. I wrote to Nimrod personally before that 45 years were taken out of me, to the 2-year-old toddler that I was in Agassi's class. And I see that this is maybe not an ongoing revolution, but an eternal dialogue that has been taking place and is taking place all these years and continues so. And also the realization that how little one learns in other groups in comparison to this one. So this was refreshing. After 2 days of that, I am refreshed. And this is to Agassi's honor and what Rafi said about his capacities as a teacher. You know, if it cannot be taught, if it's not with ease, then it doesn't exist. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you all. Thank you all.
The other thing that I'd mention in passing is that Nimrod and I have talked about whether there would be interest, if we can do so, in getting a volume together based on some of the papers that have been presented here. And do please, the paper givers, let us know about that, and we will be in touch with you if that works. I know that some participants have indicated that because of other commitments, they may not be able to contribute if such a thing happened, but it would seem to me that we have got some very worthwhile and interesting ideas here, and that it would be a shame if they were limited just to those people who participated in this.
There's no doubt that the papers here are remarkable in that they are both clear and simple and yet very interesting all the same. And I am at your service, whichever way you want me to respond or correspond or comment or whatever.
Thank you so much.
I think it's clear that it's up to Jeremy to organize it. Thank you.
When I organized the conference, Chen was mocking me. He said, this is an Agassi for dummies kind of conference. So
A what?
Agassi for dummies, you said.
No, it wasn't me. No,
I kind of liked it actually, and I think that when good philosophers speak simply and clearly,
it is an event.
Good philosophy may spring forth. It's,
Well, should we on that note conclude?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Jeremy.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much. Okay.
Thank you
Fine.
all.
Cheerio.
Thank you very much,
Nimrod.
everybody.
Thank you, Nimrod.
Thank
Thank
you.
you all.
Fine.
Bye, Agassi. Bye-bye.